Section 1. The Boy Who Dreamed of Bugs. There is a small city on the western edge of Tokyo, a place called Machida, and if you had visited it in the late 1960s or the early 1970s, you would have found something that barely exists there now. Fields. Actual open fields, full of long grass and muddy streams, overgrown thickets and patches of forest that smelled like rain even on dry days. The kind of landscape that a child could disappear into for an entire afternoon and come back with grass stains on both knees and a glass jar full of something alive and wriggling. One particular child disappeared into those fields more than most. His name was Satoshi Tajiri, and he was, by most accounts, absolutely obsessed with insects. Not in a casual, passing sort of way. Not the way most children are briefly fascinated with caterpillars before moving on to something else. Satoshi was serious about it. He caught beetles and crickets and dragonflies and strange little beetles he had never seen before, carefully identified them, studied how they moved, learned what they ate. His classmates had a nickname for him that followed him all through school, Dr. Bug. He carried that title like a badge, because to him it was one. His parents were less charmed by the whole enterprise. His father worked for Nissan, his mother kept the home, and both of them would have preferred their son apply the same obsessive attention he gave to insects toward his schoolwork. Satoshi struggled in school. Not because he was unintelligent, far from it, but because classrooms felt like cages to a boy who had grown up thinking that real knowledge lived outside, under rocks, and beside slow-moving streams. He found it nearly impossible to sit still when there was so much to observe and collect and understand. He wanted to be an entomologist when he grew up. He wanted to spend his life among insects, classifying and discovering and writing papers that other people who loved bugs would read. That was the dream. And then, slowly, something changed. Not the obsession with collecting, not the drive to seek out and catalog and possess rare things, but the landscape of Machida itself began to change around him. The fields shrank, the forests gave way. New roads appeared where streams had been. The grass lots where he had spent entire summers searching for particular beetles were flattened under the foundations of new buildings. The insects retreated, and eventually there was almost nowhere left to look for them. By the time Satoshi was a teenager, the boy who had wanted to be an entomologist had pivoted, as people often do when the world shifts beneath their feet, to something new. He found video games, and he did not find them the way most teenagers find them, as a pleasant distraction, as something to do after school. He found them the way he had found insects. He found himself obsessing over them, wanting to understand how they worked from the inside, wanting to document and share and explain. By the time he was 16 years old, he had won a design competition sponsored by Sega. By 1982, he and a group of friends had started printing a handwritten gaming magazine. They called it Game Freak. The magazine was, by any objective standard, humble. Early issues were written by hand, assembled by Satoshi, and photocopied and stapled and sold in small quantities to other people who cared about the same games. But it grew. It found readers. And one of those readers was a young man named Ken Sugimori, an artist with a delicate, distinctive style, who would later become the person responsible for giving visual life to creatures that did not yet exist. Sugimori and Tajiri became close friends. Game Freak? The magazine eventually evolved into Game Freak, the development company, founded in 1989, and the small team that had gathered around this shared passion for games set about creating their own. Their first game, Mendel Palace, was published by Nintendo. It proved they could be taken seriously. And Satoshi, who had never forgotten the feeling of searching through tall grass for something rare and alive, began to think about what it would mean to build that experience. The spark came when he saw two Game Boys connected by a link cable. It was a small thing, a peripheral that allowed two players to share information, to trade, to compete. But Satoshi looked at that thin cable and saw something else. He saw children sending creatures back and forth along a wire, the way insects might travel through burrows and tunnels underground. He saw the trading, the collecting, the thrill of encountering something you had never seen before. He saw bug collecting made digital. He pitched the idea to Nintendo somewhere around 1990. The concept was not immediately understood. Pokémon, as we know it, would not arrive for another 6 years, and those 6 years were not easy. Game Freak came close to financial collapse during development. Staff left because there was not enough money to pay them. Tajiri and Masuda and Sugimori took side jobs to keep the project alive. There were moments when the entire thing seemed like it might simply stop, not end dramatically, just slowly run out of energy and fade. But it did not stop. Tajiri never seriously considered letting it stop. This was the thing he had been working toward his entire life, even if he had not known it when he was a boy in knee-high grass with a glass jar. Pokémon Red and Pokémon Green, released in Japan in February of 1996. They were Game Boy games, selling for the equivalent of a few dollars, intended for an audience of children and marketed by a company that was best known for Mario. Nintendo's internal expectations were modest. Some people within the company thought the games were already outdated before they launched, because the Game Boy itself was aging hardware by 1996, and the industry was moving toward bigger, shinier things. What happened instead was something that nobody had planned for, and nobody entirely understood. Children in Japan began playing, and then they began talking, and then they began trading, passing creatures back and forth through those link cables exactly the way Tajiri had imagined, and the playground conversations that followed, the debates about which Pokémon was rarest, which was strongest, whether the rumors about secret Pokémon were true, created a momentum that was entirely organic and entirely unstoppable. It took 2 years for the games to reach the West. When they did, in 1998, they arrived with an animated television series, a trading card game, and a marketing campaign built around 4 words: "Gotta catch 'em all." The franchise that Satoshi Tajiri had dreamed up while staring at a link cable between 2 Game Boys was now a global phenomenon, and it had only just started. What is remarkable about all of this, looking back from the distance of nearly 30 years, is how much of the original impulse survived intact. The games are still about searching. They are still about the thrill of finding something rare in an unexpected place. They are still about the quiet satisfaction of completing a collection, of holding in your hands something that most people have never seen. The world that Tajiri built to hold all of that collecting and searching is one of the richest imaginary landscapes ever constructed in a game, and it deepens with every generation that adds to it. This video is about that world. It is about the layers of myth and history and darkness and strange beauty that the creators and writers of Pokémon have spent 3 decades building around those core ideas. It is about legendary beings that shaped the universe before there were humans to name them. It is about ghost towns and ancient ruins and Pokédex entries that keep you up at night with the things they imply. It is about the lore that most people never explore, because the games are usually too busy sending you toward the next gym badge and the anime too cheerful to linger on the darker corridors. We are going to linger. We are going to take our time. And the only thing I ask you to do while we do it is get comfortable, because this is going to take a while. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are right now and what time it is. And if you want more content like this, hit subscribe so you do not miss anything. Because we are just getting started. Section 2. Before the world was Arceus and the birth of everything. Before there was anything, there was an egg. That sounds simple, almost childlike. And there is something intentional in that simplicity. Because the creation mythology of the Pokémon world is designed to feel ancient, to feel like the kind of story that has been told and retold across generations until the edges of it have worn smooth. The myth does not explain where the egg came from. It does not explain what existed before the egg, or whether the question even makes sense. It simply begins there, floating in a void that contains nothing else. An egg, and darkness, and silence. From the egg emerged the creature that would later be known by many names. The original one, the Alpha Pokémon, the god of the Pokémon universe. We call it Arceus. What Arceus looked like when it first emerged is a question the games leave deliberately unanswered. The Arceus we encounter in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl and in Pokémon Legends, Arceus has the form of a white, quadruped creature with a golden ring around its midsection, its body marked with green cross-shaped patterns, its eyes calm and impossibly old. It moves with the unhurried quality of something that has always existed and expects to continue existing long after everything else has run its course. But this Arceus, the one players can encounter, is already diminished from what it was. It used 1,000 arms, according to the Sinnoh mythology, to shape the world. That world-shaping state is the one we never directly see. The story goes like this. After emerging from the egg, Arceus shaped nothingness into something. It created the first 3 beings to assist it, giving each a domain of reality to govern. These 3 are the creatures fans call the Creation Trio. Dialga, Palkia, and Giratina. Dialga was given mastery over time. When Dialga was born, time itself began to flow. Before that, in whatever sense the word before means without time to give it structure, there was no sequence. No before and after, no cause and effect, no aging, no waiting, no memory that could accumulate into experience. Dialga is a steel and dragon-type creature that resembles a great armored dinosaur, with a clock face pattern embedded in the gem at its chest and a bearing of absolute permanence. It does not age. It cannot be eroded. It simply continues, because time itself continues, and Dialga is the engine of that continuation. Palkia was given mastery over space. When Palkia was born, space expanded. The dimensions of the universe stretched outward in all directions, creating the distances and volumes that everything else would eventually occupy. Palkia is a water and dragon type that stands upright, its body marked with pink and purple, great curved shoulder plates encrusted with pearl-like gems, its form suggesting both power and a certain strange elegance. It is the creature responsible for the fact that the universe has size at all, that there is room for stars and planets and oceans and small human children catching insects in overgrown fields. And then there is Giratina. The story of Giratina's creation and banishment is one of the more philosophically interesting corners of Pokémon lore, and it has been told slightly differently across different games and different regions, which is exactly how myths tend to behave. In the most widely accepted version, Giratina was born alongside Dialga and Palkia, given domain over antimatter. Where Dialga and Palkia shaped the material universe, Giratina was given something harder to define, the inverse of existence, the distortion world, a place where physical laws operate differently or not at all, a place that is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, accessible only through specific rifts in reality. The reason Giratina was sent there, according to the Sinnoh legends, is that it was violent, that it acted with aggression so severe that Arceus banished it from the material universe and confined it to the distortion world as both punishment and containment. But there is a thread in the mythology, particularly in Pokémon Platinum, that suggests the banishment was not purely punishment, that the distortion world is not a prison so much as an assignment, that Giratina governs the inverse of reality, because someone has to, because without that governance the balance between existence and non-existence would collapse. Giratina is described in some tellings as the Dark Land emissary. It is not evil, exactly. It is simply what is necessary. In its origin form, the form it takes within the distortion world, Giratina has a long serpentine body with 6 legs folded against its sides, golden rib-like structures visible against its skin, and a presence that is both beautiful and deeply unsettling. In its altered form, the shape it takes when it exists in the material world, it looks more like a classical dragon, winged and heavy, with the same unnerving combination of grace and threat. Both forms have eyes that seem to look at something slightly beyond whatever you are looking at, as if Giratina is always partially occupying a different reality. Now, Arceus did not stop with the creation trio. Having established time and space and the shadowed inverse of existence, it turned to the smaller structures that the universe would need. It created the Lake Trio, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf, 3 small psychic-type beings that were given the qualities of knowledge, emotion, and willpower respectively, and sent to inhabit the lakes of the Sinnoh region where they would wait, patient and still, as guardians of the human mind. Their purpose, according to the legends, was to give these gifts to humanity: the capacity to know, to feel, and to act. Without Uxie, there would be no accumulated wisdom, no science, no art. Without Mesprit, there would be no love, no grief, no passion. Without Azelf, there would be no determination, no will to act on what is known and what is felt. It is a remarkable idea for a video game to house. The suggestion that the qualities that make human experience meaningful are not accidents of evolution, but deliberate gifts from divine beings who chose to anchor themselves in 3 particular lakes and wait for humanity to develop enough to appreciate them. The Sinnoh region, where most of this mythology is centered, is based on the northernmost main island of Japan, the island of Hokkaido, a place of cold winters and dramatic mountains, and a historical connection to indigenous Ainu culture. Mount Coronet, the great mountain that divides Sinnoh and sits at the heart of its mythology, corresponds roughly to the mountainous interior of Hokkaido. At its peak is the Spear Pillar, the place where, according to legend, Arceus created the universe. Where the egg was. Where everything began. When you visit Spear Pillar in Diamond and Pearl as a player, you arrive there in the middle of a crisis. The villainous Team Galactic has opened a portal that draws Dialga and Palkia into conflict, threatening to tear apart the fabric of reality. And for a moment, standing on that ancient stone platform at the top of that ancient mountain, the game allows you to feel the weight of what this place is. Not just a dramatic boss arena, the literal origin point of everything that exists. The mythology does not explain all of its own details, and this is intentional. Masuda and the team at Game Freak have spoken in interviews about wanting the Pokémon world to feel like a place with real history, which means leaving spaces that are not fully explained. Real mythologies have gaps and contradictions. Real ancient stories get retold and slightly changed each time. The Pokémon creation myth follows that pattern. Different regions have different stories. The Johto region's account of creation is not identical to Sinnoh's. Unova has its own version. They overlap in places and diverge in others, and none of them is presented as definitively correct, because in the world of Pokémon, as in the real world, nobody was there to record what happened before the beginning. What we can say is this. Before the world of Pokémon was the world we know from the games and the anime and the movies, it was a void. And from that void came an egg, and from the egg came a god. And that god, working with 1,000 arms that have since been lost, shaped everything that followed. It is not a bad creation myth. As creation myths go, it is actually rather good. The idea that time and space are living things, creatures rather than abstract properties, and that they exist in tension with each other, requiring a third force to maintain some kind of equilibrium between them, has a real philosophical elegance to it. It maps onto scientific ideas about the relationship between time and space in ways that feel less coincidental than they probably are. Dialga and Palkia are, in some sense, the Pokémon equivalent of the dimensions of space-time, made physical and given will. Giratina is the dark energy that fills what would otherwise be empty. Arceus is the initial condition, the boundary from which all others are derived. Whether Game Freak intended any of that depth when they wrote the mythology of Generation 4 is an open question, but the mythology holds together remarkably well, regardless of intent. And it forms the foundation on which every other piece of Pokémon lore is built. The universe exists because Arceus willed it. Time flows because Dialga was born. Space has dimension because Palkia expanded it. Giratina watches from its inverted realm, waiting. And somewhere beneath all of that, in lakes and mountains and ancient ruins, the smaller beings carry out their assigned roles, patient and ancient and largely unnoticed. That is where we begin. From there, we can look at what came after. Section 3. The ancient titans Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza. If the creation trio represents the establishment of the universe's fundamental structure, then the three beings known as the Weather Trio represent the next step down in scale, the shaping of a particular world, a planet with oceans and continents and atmosphere. And if the Sinnoh creation myth has the quality of ancient philosophy, the Hoenn creation myth has the quality of something older and more elemental. Something that feels like it was told around fires before writing existed. Long before the Hoenn region took the shape that players would recognize, before there were cities or routes or gym leaders or any human presence at all, the planet was still being decided. The land and the sea were locked in a contest that neither could win, and the sky watched from above. Kyogre was there first, or perhaps simultaneously with Groudon, depending on which account you trust. The myths do not insist on a clear chronology here. What they agree on is the essential nature of each creature. Kyogre is the sea made into a living thing. It has a body shaped loosely like an orca, vast and dark blue, with patterns that glow red along its flanks when it draws on its full power. Those glowing markings resemble wave patterns, or perhaps ancient calligraphy, depending on the angle of the light. It has the ability to call rain, to expand the oceans, to raise the water level of the entire world if it chooses to draw on the depths of what it can do. The Pokédex describes it as the personification of the seas. In its primal form, the state it occupied before the long dormancy of the ocean floor, those abilities are amplified beyond what most descriptions can conveniently hold. Primal Kyogre creates a weather condition called primordial sea, a permanent, absolute downpour that cannot be overridden by any lesser weather effect and that extinguishes fire entirely. Standing in primordial sea is like standing at the bottom of the ocean, even when you are not. Groudon is the land made into a living thing. Its body is massive and prehistoric, vaguely resembling a sauropod or a very large theropod, but covered in plates of what appear to be compressed rock, deep red and brown, with cracks in its skin that glow with the orange of magma. It can evaporate water, expand land masses, radiate an intense and searing heat that drives moisture from the air. In its primal form, Primal Groudon creates desolate land, a permanent scorching sunlight so intense it evaporates water-type attacks before they make contact and dries the very air of the atmosphere around it. To encounter Primal Groudon in Pokémon Omega Ruby is to encounter something that feels genuinely elemental, not just powerful in the way that strong Pokémon are powerful, but powerful in the way that geological forces are powerful. Slow, inevitable, and indifferent to anything smaller than a mountain range. The ancient Hoenn myths say that Kyogre created the oceans and Groudon created the continents. They may have done this simultaneously, each shaping its domain in response to the other, each expansionist impulse met by an equal counter-expansion. Or they may have done it sequentially, one following the other, each inheriting a world already partially shaped by its counterpart. The precise sequence is left ambiguous, which is appropriate, because geological time does not have the kind of clean narrative that human stories prefer. Land and sea have been reshaping each other for billions of years on the real Earth, and the Pokémon myth understands, on some level, that these are not events that happen once and then stop. What eventually happens, according to the legends recorded at Skypillar by the ancient Draconid people who lived in Hoenn before recorded history, is that Kyogre and Groudon came into direct conflict. Their desires were fundamentally incompatible. Kyogre wanted a world of water. Groudon wanted a world of land. There was no negotiated settlement between these positions, no compromised geography that satisfied both. The battle between them was the kind of battle that reshapes the planet, that causes earthquakes and floods on a scale that makes human disasters look trivial. And then Rayquaza descended from the sky. Rayquaza lives in the upper atmosphere, in the ozone layer specifically, feeding on meteoroids and cosmic particles that drift down from space. It has a long, serpentine body, brilliant green with yellow markings, and it moves through the air with the unhurried fluency of something that has never needed to worry about gravity. Its design draws from multiple traditions of dragon mythology, incorporating elements from East Asian dragons in its sinuous form and from Western dragons in its general power and presence. It is one of the most visually distinctive legendary Pokémon in the franchise, and it earns that distinction. There is genuinely nothing else that looks quite like it. Its role in the creation myth is the role of the mediator, the third force that exists not to participate in the conflict between land and sea, but to end it. Rayquaza descended from its home in the upper atmosphere, appeared above the battling titans, and through the force of its presence and its authority, stopped the fighting. Kyogre and Groudon retreated, withdrawing into their respective domains, Kyogre sinking to the bottom of the deepest part of the ocean, Groudon going deep underground. The red orb and the blue orb were created, possibly by Rayquaza itself, possibly as a natural consequence of the battle's end, to serve as seals, anchors that kept the ancient titans dormant and prevented their return. Rayquaza then returned to the sky, resumed its slow circling of the upper atmosphere, and remained there for millions of years, waiting for the next time its presence would be needed. There is a mythological precedent for this configuration that Game Freak likely drew on deliberately. In Judeo-Christian scripture, specifically in the Book of Job and in certain apocryphal texts, there are three primordial creatures: the behemoth, the leviathan, and the ziz. The behemoth is the unconquerable monster of the land, described in Job as lying in muddy ground, its bones like iron, its power beyond any human ability to contain. The leviathan is the monster of the sea, fire-breathing and ancient, the embodiment of oceanic chaos. And the ziz, less well known but present in the apocryphal tradition, is the primordial creature of the sky, so vast it can block out the sun. In some accounts, the behemoth and the leviathan are destined to battle until the end of time. Groudon, Kyogre, Rayquaza. The correspondence is striking enough that it seems deliberate, and it lends the weather trio a mythological depth that extends beyond the Pokémon franchise into traditions that are genuinely ancient. The idea of great primordial creatures representing the domains of land, sea, and sky, locked in an eternal contest that occasionally needs an outside force to interrupt, is one of those narrative structures that appears across widely separated mythological traditions, suggesting it maps onto something in human experience that transcends any particular culture. What makes the Hoenn telling of this myth particularly effective is the physical presence of the evidence. Sky Pillar, the ancient stone tower that rises from a remote island in Hoenn, is covered in murals left by the Draconid people. These murals depict the ancient battle, the descent of Rayquaza, the withdrawal of the Titans. They are presented as genuinely old, as artifacts from a civilization that predates the current Hoenn culture. When you stand inside Sky Pillar and look at those murals, you are looking at someone's attempt to record history that was already ancient when they recorded it. There is something poignant about the Draconids specifically. They are a small, scattered community of people in Hoenn who have devoted themselves to the service of Rayquaza for generations beyond counting. They maintain a dragon flute, an instrument capable of calling Rayquaza from the upper atmosphere and pass down the knowledge of how to play it from elder to elder. They live with an awareness that their entire culture exists in relationship to something so much larger and older than themselves that the relationship can never be fully understood, only honored. They are, in the vocabulary of religious studies, a hierophany community, people whose entire social identity is organized around a manifestation of the sacred. In Pokémon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the Draconid Elder Zinnia occupies a complex role in the story that elevates her beyond the typical NPC. She is simultaneously a keeper of ancient truth and someone who has been made desperate by a terrible decision her people are facing, and the weight of that tension gives her a gravity that most Pokémon characters do not carry. She understands the legends not as stories but as operational history, as a record of events that could recur and for which her people hold the key to the response. The fact that this knowledge is held by a marginalized community, a small and scattered people who most of Hoenn's mainstream population probably regards as eccentric at best, adds a particular resonance to her role. Primal Groudon and Primal Kyogre, the forms these beings take when they fully revert to their ancient power, were a revelation when Omega, Ruby, and Alpha Sapphire introduced them. They are not simply stronger versions of the Pokémon players remembered from Ruby and Sapphire. They feel genuinely different. Primal Groudon gains the fire typing, becoming ground and fire together, and its appearance shifts in ways that make it look even more geological, even more like a living landscape, with the cracks in its skin glowing brighter and the impression of immense internal heat becoming impossible to ignore. Primal Kyogre gains blue light where there had been red, its patterns shifting, and its presence in battle creates the sensation of being submerged even through a screen. These are creatures that existed before humanity, before Pokémon trainers and gym badges and Pokédexes. They predate the civilization that named them and built myths around them by a geological age. When you encounter them in the games, you are not just fighting a powerful opponent. You are standing in the presence of history so deep it stops being history and starts being geology. And Rayquaza watches from above, patient, orbiting, always ready to descend when the Titans wake again. Section 4. The Tower that Burned Lugia, Ho-Oh, and the Three Beasts. There is a city in the Johto region called Ecruteak. It is an old city, one of the oldest in the Pokémon world, and it carries its age the way old places do, with a visible archaeology of its own past. The architecture is traditional, all wooden beams and curved roofs and stone lanterns. The gym leader, Morty, is a young man who studies ghost-type Pokémon and who speaks with a slightly distracted quality, as if he is always listening for something just outside normal hearing range. The residents of Ecruteak are aware that they live beside one of the most significant historical sites in the Pokémon world, and that awareness gives the town a quality of quiet solemnity that sets it apart from other cities in Johto. At the center of that solemnity are two towers, or rather, one tower and one ruin. The Bell Tower, which stands in the northeast of Ecruteak, is a 9-story structure of graceful design, still intact, still reaching upward. It is also called the Tin Tower in some translations, and in Heart Gold and Soul Silver it becomes the site of Ho-Oh's return. It is a beautiful structure, and if you spend any time near it in the games you develop the sense that it is waiting for something, which it is. The Burnt Tower stands in the northwest, and it is exactly what the name suggests. The ruins of something that was once the equal of the Bell Tower, now collapsed to 2 floors, its interior scorched and crumbling. Wild wheezing inhabit its shadowed lower levels. There is a hole in the floor of the second story that leads down into a basement, and in that basement, in the original Gold and Silver games, you can find 3 sleeping Pokémon, Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, who will wake as you approach and scatter into the Johto region, where they can be encountered in tall grass as rare, wandering creatures that flee from battle and must be slowly tracked across the map. The story that connects these 2 towers and these 3 wandering beasts is one of the most quietly heartbreaking pieces of lore in the franchise. Long ago, according to the legends of Ecruteak, both towers stood at full height, the Bell Tower and the Brass Tower, and both were inhabited by great legendary Pokémon. Ho-Oh nested atop the Bell Tower, the rainbow Pokémon, the guardian of the skies, its 7-colored plumage catching light and scattering it into rainbows that arced across the city. Lugia rested atop the Brass Tower, the guardian of the seas, its enormous white and blue form draped across the uppermost platform like a creature that understood its own weight and rested carefully because of it. For a long time this was the arrangement, and the arrangement was good. The 2 towers stood in balance. One bird of fire and sky on one tower, one great silver creature of the sea on another, and the city of Ecruteak flourished under their presence. The residents built shrines. They told stories. They considered themselves fortunate to live in the place where these beings had chosen to rest. Then, 300 years before the events of Pokémon Gold and Silver, a fire broke out. What caused the fire is not stated with precision in the games. The legend says simply that a lightning bolt struck the Brass Tower, and that the fire spread quickly, and that when the fire finally burned itself out, the Brass Tower had collapsed. 3 Pokémon who had been sheltering inside the tower when the fire broke out perished in the blaze. Their identities are not specified, some accounts suggesting they were already the legendary beasts who had existed independently, others suggesting they were simply 3 unnamed Pokémon who happened to be inside the tower when disaster struck. What happened next is the part of the story that gives Ho-Oh its particular significance in Johto mythology. Ho-Oh descended from the Bell Tower, and it looked at what the fire had done, and it raised the dead. The 3 Pokémon that had died in the Brass Tower fire were reborn from Ho-Oh's tears as Raikou, Entei, and Suicune, each one embodying an aspect of the event that had killed them and the power that remade them. Raikou carries the lightning that started the fire. Its body crackles with electricity, its movements so fast they seem to leave after images. It represents the strike, the moment of ignition, the instantaneous catastrophic event. Entei carries the fire itself, its huge body radiating heat, its roar capable of generating eruptions, its presence so overwhelming that a new Entei is said to be born somewhere in the world whenever a new volcano forms. It represents the element, the burning itself, the sustained and devouring power of the flames. Suicune carries the rains that eventually extinguish the blaze. It is the most beautiful of the 3, a blue creature that moves with the grace of a current, able to purify polluted water, running always north, always into the wind, as if searching for something. It represents resolution, the cleansing that follows destruction. After the resurrection, Lugia departed the ruins of the Brass Tower and made its new home in the Whirl Islands, a cluster of small rocky outcrops off the southern coast of Johto, surrounded by powerful whirlpools that Lugia itself is said to have created by dispersing what had once been a single, larger island. The whirlpools serve as both moat and marker. They say this place is mine, approach with respect. Lugia chose isolation, retreating from human proximity, perhaps because the fall of the Brass Tower had demonstrated something about what proximity to human civilization cost. Ho-Oh, by contrast, departed and went searching. The Pokédex tells us that Ho-Oh searches the world for a trainer with a pure heart. It will appear when it finds one. It was this quality that gave the moment in the very first episode of the Pokémon anime such unexpected resonance. As Ash Ketchum begins his journey, stumbling out onto Route 1 in the rain without even a proper starter Pokémon, something appears in the sky. A massive bird, impossibly bright, trailing a rainbow behind it. It is gone almost before Ash can register what he has seen, and nobody believes him when he describes it later. The identity of the bird is not confirmed in the original episode, but it is Ho-Oh. And if you believe the myth, then what happened in that moment is this. The rainbow Pokémon, which flies over the world looking for a trainer with a pure heart, looked down at the boy in the rain who had just made the decision to try anyway, even though everything had already gone wrong, and saw what it was looking for. Ho-Oh's design draws on the Fenghuang of Chinese mythology, the phoenix-like divine bird associated with prosperity, good fortune, and the south. The Fenghuang is sometimes described as appearing only in times of peace and hiding away during turmoil. Ho-Oh echoes this association, appearing to those who are worthy and remaining hidden otherwise. Its Japanese name, Huo, directly references the Chinese characters for Fenghuang. Even the story of its resurrection of the three beasts echoes an old Osaka folktale about a phoenix that rose from the ashes of a destroyed pagoda, the kind of folk story that travels across generations until it settles into myths that feel both specific and universal. Lugia's origins are less clearly rooted in a single, real-world myth. Its name may draw from the Latin luna, or from the chemical element lutetium, which is silver-colored, or from the word beluga, connecting it to the great whales of the real ocean. Its design combines elements of bird and whale and something else harder to classify, something that seems to have been designed specifically to be both beautiful and slightly alien. It is a psychic and flying type, which is an unusual combination that feels appropriate for something that lives at the intersection of sea and sky, that is at home in the depths of the ocean, and also capable of soaring through clouds. Lugia's role as the guardian of the three legendary birds of Kanto, Articuno, Zapdos, and Moltres is developed primarily in the second Pokémon film, Pokémon the Movie, The Power of One, where the conflict between the three birds threatens to tear apart the natural order and Lugia must be awakened to restore balance. This mirrors its general role in the mythology. Lugia is a peacekeeper, a being whose power is so immense that its very presence can calm conflicts between other powerful beings. The film presents Lugia with a dignity that the game's relatively brief treatment of it does not fully capture, giving it a voice, in the Japanese original, that is measured and sorrowful and carries the weight of something that has seen too much to be easily surprised. Suicune, of the three legendary beasts, became the mascot of Pokémon Crystal, the third version of the second generation, and this choice elevated it above its siblings in certain fans' eyes. The Crystal version gave Suicune a dedicated storyline involving a character named Usain, a researcher who has spent his life searching for the creature, and whose search is treated not as an obsession but as a calling. Usain has encountered Suicune multiple times and been unable to capture or even approach it, and rather than being frustrated by this, he has become more reverent. He understands that Suicune allows itself to be seen when and only when it chooses to be seen, and that every glimpse is a gift. This is one of the quieter pieces of Pokémon lore, and one of the more resonant ones. The idea that some legendary beings are not simply powerful opponents to be overcome, but presences that exist in relationship with the world on their own terms, visible or invisible as they choose, always moving, always themselves. Raikou has perhaps received less attention than its two siblings, which is unfortunate, because its design is genuinely striking, and its implied lore, the lightning made into a living thing, the instantaneous and catastrophic reborn as something that runs constantly as if it cannot stop, as if stopping would be a betrayal of what it is, has a poetic quality that rewards thinking about. Raikou moves faster than almost anything in the Johto region. In the games, it has a tendency to flee before a battle can be concluded. This is usually understood as a mechanical challenge, a frustrating aspect of the encounter design, but in the context of the mythology, it reads differently. Raikou is lightning. It was born from the moment of the strike. Of course, it cannot stay still. The three beasts wander Johto separately, following their own paths, appearing in tall grass for brief encounters that disappear almost before they can be properly processed. In the mythology, they have been wandering since Ho-Oh remade them 300 years ago. They will keep wandering until something calls them home. What that something is, the games do not say. Section 5. The town that cannot let go. Lavender Town and the Marowak. If there is one location in the Pokémon world that captures the imagination and refuses to let go, it is Lavender Town. It sits in the northeast corner of the Kanto region, accessible through Rock Tunnel, a long and dark cave passage that must be navigated largely blind in the original games without the proper HM. Coming out of that tunnel and into Lavender Town for the first time as a child produced a specific feeling that players from that era still describe with unusual vividness. The sudden shift in color palette, the buildings that were somehow both smaller and heavier than anywhere else in Kanto, the music of Lavender Town in the original Pokémon Red and Green is one of the most discussed pieces of video game composition in history, and this despite being technically primitive even by the standards of its time. It runs on 3-note oscillations, repeating and shifting in a minor key that never quite resolves into anything comfortable. It is not frightening in any obvious way. It does not employ the dramatic musical cues of horror films. It is simply deeply, persistently unsettling, in the way that a sound heard from the next room at 3 in the morning is unsettling. Not clearly dangerous, but clearly not right. The music was revised between the Japanese and international releases. The original Japanese version had slightly different frequencies in its upper registers, and an urban legend emerged in the early 2000s that these frequencies had caused a spike in health problems and suicides among children who had played the Japanese versions. This story, which has come to be known as Lavender Town Syndrome, is entirely fabricated. The data points cited in the original telling were invented. The medical claims have no basis, and the story spread through early internet forums precisely because it was the right kind of unverifiable. But the legend says something real about how the music actually made people feel, because something about that composition lodges in the part of the mind that does not reason clearly and refuses to be argued out of its discomfort. What Lavender Town actually is, within the Pokémon world, is a graveyard town. The Pokémon Tower that dominates it is a 7-story structure that functions as a cemetery for deceased Pokémon. People travel to Lavender Town to bury their partners, to lay wreaths, to stand in front of stone markers and remember. The wild Pokémon encountered inside the tower, Ghastly and Haunter and Gengar, are treated within the game's logic as genuine ghosts, the lingering spirits of dead Pokémon who have not yet passed on. The channelers who wander the upper floors of the tower are women who have come to meditate and commune with these spirits, though in the game they have themselves become possessed by aggressive spirits and must be battled before the player can pass. There is something considered in this design. Most Pokémon towns, most of the early game's geography, is structured around commerce and competition. You arrive at a gym, you fight the gym leader, you get a badge, you move on. Lavender Town does not have a gym. It does not have anything to compete for. It is simply a place where people go when they have lost something and need somewhere to put the grief. And in the tower, at the top of the 5th floor, there is a ghost that the player cannot identify without the Sylph Scope. Without that item, it appears as an undifferentiated presence, a white form that stops you in your tracks and cannot be bypassed. The game communicates through this mechanic that some things cannot be understood without the right equipment for seeing them clearly. With the Sylph Scope, the ghost resolves into something specific and heartbreaking. It is a Marowak, a mother Marowak, to be precise, whose Cubone child is somewhere in the building and who died trying to protect it. Team Rocket, the criminal organization that serves as the antagonists of the first-generation games, had come to Lavender Town to exploit the Pokémon Tower. They wanted the bones of dead Pokémon, because bones and rare Pokémon parts could be sold, and Cubone's skull, specifically the skull it carries as its helmet, which the mythology establishes as the skull of its deceased mother, was something the organization considered valuable. The mother, Marowak, was killed in her attempt to prevent Team Rocket from taking her child, and then her spirit remained on the 5th floor of the tower, unable to leave, unable to rest, still caught in the moment of loss that preceded her death. The moment when the player faces the ghost of the Marowak and helps it find peace so that it can finally pass on is one of the more quietly emotional moments in the first-generation games. The game does not editorialize about it. There is no dramatic speech. The ghost simply attacks, as ghosts in Pokémon Tower do, and when it is defeated, it dissipates, and then it is gone, and the player can continue upward. But if you have been paying attention to the pieces of story scattered across the lower floors, assembled from fragments of NPC dialogue and the presence of the Cubone wandering the building, the weight of what just happened is not small. Cubone is, in many ways, the emotional center of Lavender Town's lore. It is a small Pokémon that wears the skull of its mother, according to its Pokédex entries across multiple games. It cries at night, and its cries are mistaken for the wind. No two Cubones wear the same skull, because no two mothers are the same. It is the kind of detail that does not fit comfortably in a game aimed primarily at children, and that discomfort is part of what makes it effective. The franchise is willing, occasionally, to look at grief without softening it. The broader world of Lavender Town rewards careful exploration. Mr. Fuji, the kind elderly man who lives in the volunteer Pokémon house on the north side of town and cares for abandoned and orphaned Pokémon, has a history that connects the town to the larger Pokémon narrative in unexpected ways. His real name, according to the accumulated lore of the franchise, is Fuji, and he was once a scientist involved in the research that produced Mewtwo. The experiments that occurred at the laboratory on Cinnabar Island, the notes that can be found scattered across the Pokémon mansion, the creation of a being that should not exist. Fuji was part of all of that, and he ended up in Lavender Town afterward, giving what he could to the creatures that society had abandoned, living with whatever he knew about what had been done. In the games, when Team Rocket takes over the Pokémon Tower, they also take Fuji hostage. He has gone to the tower to calm the spirit of the Marowak, because he understood what her lingering presence meant, and Team Rocket has used the situation to keep him from interfering with their operations. The player rescues him by driving Team Rocket out and facing the ghost at the top of the tower. Fuji, freed, gives the player a Pokémon flute as thanks, an item that will be needed to awaken Snorlax blocking the road to the north. The connection between Fuji's past and the Cinnabar Island research becomes significant in a specific way when you consider the geography of the game. Lavender Town is in the northeast of Kanto. Cinnabar Island is in the southwest. Between them is a large portion of the entire region, a journey that takes considerable time by any measure. And yet Fuji ended up in Lavender Town, of all places. The place in Kanto furthest from everything he had done. The place built around grief and the honoring of the dead. That is not the kind of detail that ends up in a game by accident. The fans who grew up with Lavender Town describe the experience of arriving there for the first time as genuinely formative. Not traumatic exactly, but marked. It was the moment when the Pokémon world demonstrated that it contained loss. That the cheerful music of Pallet Town and the optimism of Professor Oak's send-off were not the full story, that somewhere in the same world there was a building full of graves and a mother's ghost still waiting for her child to be safe. That information changed the way those players understood everything else in the game. If Lavender Town was possible, then the rest of the world was real in a different way. The Lavender Town music has been remixed and reimagined hundreds of times in the years since. Game Freak itself used variations of it in the Pokémon Go Halloween events of 2017, 2019, and 2020. It has never lost its quality of slight wrongness, its refusal to resolve into something comfortable. It is a piece of music that sounds like something just outside normal sight, which is exactly right for a town that is built around exactly that. In Pokémon Gold and Silver, the Pokémon Tower was transformed into the Kanto Radio Tower. The graveyard was moved to a small structure south of the tower. Lavender Town's music changed completely, becoming cheerful and modern, reflecting the new technology that had arrived and the passing of the original grief. Some players found this update reassuring. Some found it sad. The sense that you were being told the past was done with, that the graves had been moved aside to make room for radio signals, that the grief had been not resolved but simply replaced, landed differently on different people. But the Mother Marowak story did not change. It was simply no longer happening in a tower that still stood. It was history now, which is perhaps the only kind of resolution grief ever really gets. Section 6. The Sorrow of a Manufactured God Mewtwo. There is an entry in a journal found in the ruined mansion on Cinnabar Island that reads, in various translations, "We have succeeded in creating the most powerful Pokémon ever." And the next entry reads, "But nothing came of it." Those two sentences, close together in a journal belonging to someone we never meet, describing the creation of something that broke free and destroyed everything around it, may be the most efficient summary of hubris in any game aimed at children. Mewtwo, the 150th entry in the original Pokédex, found in Cerulean Cave deep underground, accessible only after the player has defeated the Elite Four and become champion, as if the game is saying, you have to earn the right to encounter this. It sits at the deepest accessible room of the cave, at a level significantly higher than anything else the player has faced, and it is the color of a bruise, pale purple with gray undertones and large blue eyes that do not convey what most Pokémon eyes convey, which is some version of the creature's essential nature. Mewtwo's eyes convey something else, an awareness that is too complete, an intelligence looking outward from behind those eyes and finding the act of being looked at insufficient. The Pokédex entry for Mewtwo in the original Pokémon Red reads, "It was created by a scientist after years of horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments." The word horrific is doing significant work there. The games use that kind of language very rarely. Difficult, dangerous, powerful, these are common descriptors. Horrific is a judgment. The creation story of Mewtwo is assembled from several sources. The journal fragments in the Pokémon Mansion, the Pokédex entries across multiple generations, the supplementary materials released with the anime films, And the cut prologue to Pokémon, the first movie, which was included in some home video releases and later adapted into a special. Together, they form a picture that is not quite consistent across all versions but has a clear emotional shape regardless of the specific details. A scientist known as Dr. Fuji in the anime continuity had a daughter named Amber who died in a car accident. The grief of that loss drove him to pursue cloning technology, driven by the hope that he might bring his daughter back. Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, heard about Fuji's work and recognized an opportunity. He would fund Fuji's research in exchange for the scientist applying his cloning expertise to a different project, creating the most powerful Pokémon that had ever existed, a perfect weapon. Mew was discovered, according to the Jungle Journal in the Pokémon Mansion in the jungles of Guyana. A pregnant Mew, in some accounts, or simply a living Mew whose DNA was extracted. The embryo was modified, the genetic sequence altered through the application of technology that the journal describes but does not fully explain. Human genetic material was also incorporated into the experiment, according to some versions of the story. In the Pokémon Adventures manga, gym leader Blaine of Cinnabar Island was a Team Rocket scientist who contributed his own cells to the creation of Mewtwo, a detail that would later become personally significant in ways the manga explores at length. Mewtwo was created. In the cut prologue to the first movie, the period before the creature's birth is shown in unusual detail. While still in the gestation tank, Mewtwo communicated psychically with the other clones being grown nearby, including a clone of Amber that Fuji had created in the hope of seeing his daughter's consciousness restored. The clone of Amber, designated Amber 2 in the prologue, was awake and aware inside the tank, and she and Mewtwo talked. She told him about the world outside. She told him that life was beautiful. The other clones faded. Amber 2 faded. And before she disappeared, she told Mewtwo not to cry, that tears were something creatures felt when they were sad. Mewtwo asked why he felt so sad. Amber 2 didn't answer. She was already gone. Mewtwo emerged. The scientists celebrated. They had created the most powerful Pokémon in the world, designed to serve as the ultimate weapon for Team Rocket's ambitions. They prepared to test its abilities, to put it through its paces, to establish the parameters of its usefulness as a tool. Mewtwo destroyed them. It destroyed the laboratory. It burned everything it had seen in its first moments of existence and flew into the sky and did not stop. In Cerulean Cave, where the player eventually finds it, Mewtwo has been for some time, sitting in the deepest accessible chamber, surrounded by wild Pokémon who have learned to keep their distance, isolated in a place where no ordinary person can reach it. It is not hiding exactly. It chose this cave after some period of wandering, and it chose the deepest part of it, and it has been there since. Whether it is waiting for something or has simply stopped moving is ambiguous in a way that feels very deliberate. The Pokédex entry in Pokémon Leaf Green states, "A Pokémon that was created by genetic manipulation." However, even though the scientific power of humans created this Pokémon's body, they failed to endow Mewtwo with a compassionate heart. The failed to endow is extraordinary phrasing. It implies that compassion was on the list of things the scientists intended to create, that it was a deliberate specification rather than simply something they forgot to consider. Which suggests that either compassion is a quality that can be engineered, and the scientists tried and failed, or that the scientists included it in the specifications knowing they could not deliver it, which is a different kind of horror. What Mewtwo is grappling with, in the mythology of the franchise, is something that philosophers have given many names over the centuries. The question of what it means to exist as something that was created rather than born, whether a created being has rights, whether the purpose for which you were created defines what you are, or whether you can define yourself against that purpose, whether the creators owe the created anything, and if so, what, whether existence itself is a gift when the terms of that existence were never agreed to. The anime version of this, developed in Pokémon, the first movie, is the most widely seen treatment of Mewtwo's story. The film follows Mewtwo as it invites a group of the world's strongest trainers to a tournament on New Island, where it reveals its actual plan, to demonstrate the superiority of cloned Pokémon over natural ones, and to do so through a battle that Mewtwo intends to be final. The philosophical content of the film was often treated as simple children's movie moralizing when it was released, and the film has its structural flaws. But Mewtwo's central argument, which is genuinely engaged with rather than simply dismissed, is not uncomplicated. It asks whether the act of creation confers ownership, whether humans have the right to decide what exists and then use what they have decided, whether the creature that is made to serve has any obligation to serve. Mew's answer, delivered through the resolution of the film, is essentially that it does not matter, that you are what you are, regardless of how you came to be. That origin does not determine worth, that the fact of existence is sufficient. Mewtwo, at the end of the film, chooses to erase the memory of the events on New Island from every human and Pokémon who witnessed them, and then leaves. It departs to a place where it can exist without being found or used, where it can simply be, and the trainers are left on the beach with no memory of what happened, holding their Pokémon, and the world goes on. The second Mewtwo film, Mewtwo Returns, released as a TV special in Japan and later internationally, follows Mewtwo to a hidden valley in Mount Quena, where it has gathered other cloned Pokémon and established a community. It does not want to be found. Giovanni and Team Rocket located. There is a confrontation. The resolution involves Mewtwo choosing, once again, to sacrifice its own continued presence in a particular place in order to protect the beings it has come to care for. These films establish something about Mewtwo that the games leave implicit, that the compassion the scientists failed to create developed anyway, through experience and suffering and relationship. That the manufactured heart, shaped by loss and anger, eventually arrived at something that looked a great deal like what the scientists claimed to have been unable to give it. That is a quiet triumph, made more quiet by the fact that Mewtwo would not describe it as a triumph. It would simply continue, existing on its own terms, in whatever cave or valley or hidden peak is most remote from the humans who made it and the uses they imagined for it. The relationship between Mewtwo and Mew, the creature it was made from, is another thread that the franchise has handled with surprising care. Mew is playful and ancient, and apparently deeply comfortable with its own existence, in a way that Mewtwo is not. Mew appears in the games as a hidden presence, available through events and promotions, and eventually through legitimate gameplay in later generations. Always with the same quality. It seems to know exactly what it is, and to find this deeply satisfactory. Mewtwo shares Mew's DNA but did not inherit this ease. Where Mew is at home in existence, Mewtwo is always negotiating with it. The theory that Ditto is a failed clone of Mew, never officially confirmed by Game Freak, draws on several pieces of observable evidence that have accumulated over the years. Ditto is found in Pokémon Yellow exclusively in the Cinnabar Mansion and Cerulean Cave, the two locations most directly connected to the Mewtwo cloning experiments. Ditto weighs exactly 8.8 pounds in both its normal and shiny forms, which is the same weight as Mew. Ditto's signature move is Transform, which allows it to become any Pokémon it sees. Mew, according to its Pokédex entry, contains the genetic code of every Pokémon. These are not proofs. They are suggestions, placed carefully enough that the theory hangs together without being confirmed. This is the kind of lore storytelling that the Pokémon franchise does best, leaving enough space that the imagination fills it in, and the filling in feels earned. What can be said with certainty is this. Something was made in the basement of that mansion on Cinnabar Island. The making of it involved things that the journal's author, whoever they were, found necessary to describe as horrific. The thing that was made broke free, and somewhere deep in Cerulean Cave, it is still working out what to do with the fact of its existence. Section 7. Letters in Stone. The Unown and the Ruins of Alph. West of Violet City. South of Route 36. There is a place that the archaeologists have been studying for years and understand less the longer they study it. The ruins of Alph are one of the most visited locations in the Johto region and also one of the least explained, which is saying something in a world full of ancient mysteries and legendary Pokémon. Other ancient sites have legends attached to them, creation myths, stories of battles between titans or gifts from gods. The ruins of Alph have, essentially, questions. And the questions get more interesting the more carefully you look. The ruins themselves are a series of chambers built into a rocky hillside, constructed in an architectural style that does not match anything found elsewhere in Johto. The materials are old enough that the exact composition has proven difficult to date with precision. The structures seem to have no practical purpose. They are large and empty, their walls covered in carvings of Pokémon. Some of those Pokémon are recognizable species. Some appear to be species that were extinct by the time the ruins were constructed, which is the first genuinely strange detail, because it implies that whoever built these ruins had access to knowledge of creatures that had not existed for a very long time. Inside 4 of the chambers, there are tile puzzles built into the floors. When you solve a puzzle by rearranging the tiles into the correct image, the floor beneath you cracks and you fall into an underground chamber. And in that underground chamber, the walls are covered in writing. Specifically, they are covered in Unown. Unown are small Pokémon shaped like the letters of the Latin alphabet. Each individual Unown resembles a single letter, from A through Z plus 2 punctuation forms in later games. They do not have powerful attacks. They are not strong in battle. Their Pokédex entries are among the most philosophically unusual in the franchise, describing them as having existed since ancient times, noting that scholars have studied the relationship between Unown and human language for years without reaching a conclusion, suggesting that when many Unown are gathered together, strange things begin to happen, that their power becomes something different from the power of a single one. The connection between Unown and the ruins of Alph is established explicitly. Pokémon Crystal states that the puzzles in the ruin chambers are signals that summon the Unown. Solving the puzzle is described as completing a message, which implies there is a message, which implies someone composed it, which implies the ruins were built by people who knew about Unown and who understood, or believed, that solving certain configurations of tile would draw the creatures out. The ruins are not simply decorated with Unown imagery. They are, or were, a mechanism for communicating with them. What that communication was intended to accomplish is the central unanswered question of the ruins of Alph. Some researchers, both in-universe characters and fans working outside the game world, have proposed that the ruins were a temple, that the civilization who built them, called in some fan reconstructions the Alphans, venerated the Unown as divine beings and built the ruins as a site of worship and communion. The idea that solving the tile puzzles is the equivalent of correctly performing a ritual, that the falling floor is the consequence of having done the thing right, that the emergence of the Unown afterward is not a random event, but a response to a completed summons, supports this interpretation. Others have proposed that the ruins are less a temple than a library, that the Unown, who appear to carry within their form some relationship to language itself, were understood by the Alphans as living letters, and that the civilization built the ruins as a place to study and preserve them. The hidden messages revealed by solving the puzzles and using various key items in the underground chambers read things like escape and light and fear and danger, a series of warnings that suggest the builders knew something troubling about the Unown or about what the Unown could do. In Pokémon, Spell of the Unown, the 3rd Pokémon film, the nature of that power is given a dramatic illustration. A young girl named Molly, grieving the disappearance of her father, accidentally activates a collection of Unown figurines in her father's study. The Unown emerge and respond to the intensity of her grief and her desires by reshaping reality. They encase her home in crystal, create a false version of her father, generate illusions of the Pokémon she wishes she had, and seal her inside a world made of her own wanting. The Unown in the film do not act maliciously. They appear to be responding to emotional input the way a very powerful but incomprehensible mechanism responds to the signals it receives. They are not evil. They are capable of something that evil things are also capable of, reshaping the world without regard for whether the reshaping is good. The Sinjo ruins, discovered in the post-game content of Heart Gold and Soul Silver through a special event involving the mythical Pokémon Arceus, connect the Unown to a larger cosmological story. The ruins are located north of the Johto region, in a place that also connects to Sinnoh, and at their center is a ring that resembles the ring around Arceus's body. Completing the event there allows Arceus to create a member of the Creation Trio. The Unown who inhabit the Sinjo ruins take their places in patterns around the central ring, as if they are always present at the moment of creation, as if this is their natural context. This detail has led to one of the more philosophically interesting fan theories in the Pokémon community, that the Unown are not simply Pokémon who happen to look like letters, but that they are in some sense the foundational language of the universe. That when Arceus shaped existence, it did so through something like speech or writing, and that the Unown are the preserved residue of that creative act. They are what remains when you say the words that make worlds. The letters, scattered and individual and apparently powerless, that are actually the substrate on which everything is written. This theory gains some support from an unusual source, the development history of Gold and Silver. According to notes from the development period, the Unown were originally planned to have a more direct connection to Arceus. The ambiguity that exists in the final games, where the connection is hinted at but never confirmed, appears to have been a deliberate artistic choice rather than an oversight. The story of the Unknown and the ruins of Alf was always intended to be a question rather than an answer. The ruins themselves changed in significant ways between Gold and Silver and their remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver. In the remakes, the puzzles are more elaborate, the underground chambers more varied, and additional items can be found that, when brought to specific spots in the underground area, reveal hidden messages in unknown text. Reading these messages requires knowledge of the unknown cipher, which players can acquire by catching various unknown and consulting the Pokédex. The act of decoding the messages in unknown text, then, requires using the creatures themselves as keys to their own writing, which has a recursive quality that feels very intentional. The messages, once decoded, are not revelatory in a conventional sense. They do not explain who built the ruins or why. They express something more like emotions, curiosity, wonder, warning, greeting. They feel less like historical records than like something left by beings who were aware that something was coming to read them and wanted to communicate not information but tone. The emotional fact of presence, of having been here. In Pokémon Legends, Arceus, the Unknown reappears scattered across the ancient Hisui region, hidden in hard-to-reach places, on the branches of specific trees, behind waterfalls, atop pillars of stone, tucked under rock formations in caves. Finding them requires sustained exploration and attention. Their presence in Hisui, which predates Johto in the chronological order of the Pokémon world, establishes that the Unknown have existed for at least as long as the oldest known civilization in the franchise. Possibly longer. The Celestica people of ancient Hisui appear to have had knowledge of the Unknown. Their ruins share architectural elements with the ruins of Alf in a way that suggests a cultural connection across an enormous span of time and distance. What the Unknown know, or whether they know anything in the conventional sense, remains the central mystery. Their Pokédex entries describe them as always moving, as having an energy that is released when they are together, as being somehow responsive to thought. They may be sentient. They may be something different from sentient, something for which human cognitive categories are not quite the right shape. They look like language, but they may predate language. They respond to ritual, but they may not understand what ritual means. They are present at the moment of creation and scattered across the ruins of ancient civilizations and hidden in the hard-to-reach places of the oldest known region in the Pokémon world, and nobody, not the scholars who study them and not the game writers who created them, seems entirely sure what to make of them. That is, in the end, exactly as it should be. Some mysteries are not invitations to solve them. They are invitations to sit with the fact of not knowing, which is a different and sometimes more valuable experience. Section 8. What the Pokédex does not want you to notice. There is a phrase that appears in one form or another in several different Pokédex entries, across several different generations. It is said that those 4 words are doing a lot of work. They signal that what follows is legend rather than confirmed fact, traditional knowledge rather than scientific observation. But in the Pokémon world, where the Pokédex is presented as a scientific instrument compiled from accumulated research, the distinction between "it is said that" and the unqualified declarative creates an interesting epistemic space. Sometimes the Pokédex is hedging because the claim is genuinely unverified. Sometimes it is hedging because the claim is actually true but so disturbing that hedging feels more responsible. And sometimes, if you read enough Pokédex entries in sequence, you get the impression that the hedging is polite, that the person who wrote the entry knew perfectly well what they were looking at and chose the phrasing carefully. The ghost-type Pokémon entries are where this quality is most apparent. Yamask was introduced in Pokémon Black and White, a small ghost-type Pokémon with a body like a wisp of smoke and a tail that holds a golden mask. The mask is described, across multiple Pokédex entries, as having been the face this Pokémon wore when it was human. Pokémon Black states, each one carries a mask that used to be its face when it was alive. Sometimes they look at it and cry. That sentence has layers. The first is the baseline horror, a Pokémon that was once a human being, reduced to a wandering spirit that carries its own former face. The second is the grief implied by the second sentence. It is not that the Yamask occasionally glances at the mask and feels a slight unease. It looks at it and cries. The mask is a constant reminder of what was lost, and the response to that reminder is not numbness or acceptance but active sorrow, repeated. every time the mask is looked at, and the Yamask presumably looks at it often. It is hanging from its tail. It is always there. What happened to the humans who became Yamask is not explained. Whether it was a specific catastrophe, a natural process in the Pokémon world, or something that can happen to anyone in the right circumstances is deliberately left unclear. But the implication that the boundary between human and Pokémon is permeable, that people can become Pokémon, that you might encounter a Pokémon in a cave or a ruin that was once someone's child, is one of the most quietly destabilizing ideas in the franchise. Yamask is not alone in suggesting this. Kadabra's Fire Red Pokédex entry states that a boy with extrasensory powers awakened one morning as a Kadabra. Gengar's Moon entry states that it was once human itself. Frostlass is described as the soul of a woman who died in the mountains, now inhabiting an icicle. And Phantump, introduced in Pokémon X and Y, is a small tree stump Pokémon that is, according to its Sun Pokédex entry, a stump possessed by the spirits of children who died in the forest. The Phantump entry is worth spending a moment with. Children who died in the forest, it says. Not old people, not travelers, not adults who became lost, children. And the entry notes that Phantump's cry sounds like eerie screams, and that Phantump are prone to imitating the voice of a child, which lures more children into the forest. There is a recursive horror in that last detail that the entry presents with a calm that refuses to acknowledge what it is describing. The creature, which is a dead child, makes sounds like a living child, which leads living children to their deaths, which creates more Phantump. It is a closed loop of tragedy described in the matter-of-fact tone of a nature documentary. Phantump's evolved form, Trevenant, is a large tree Pokémon that can control forests and prevent anyone who displeases it from leaving. It has a sense of justice, according to its Pokédex, attacking anyone who harms the forest it protects. This might sound like a woodland guardian, a relatively benign protector of nature, but the forest it protects contains Phantump, which are the spirits of children who died there. Trevenant is protecting the domain in which children die and become ghost Pokémon. Its guardianship ensures the continued existence of the conditions that produce more Phantump. This is either an oversight or a comment on how certain kinds of tragedy perpetuate themselves. Given how carefully constructed the ghost-type lore of the 6th generation is, an oversight seems unlikely. Drifloon was introduced in Generation 4, a small balloon-like ghost and flying type with a heart-shaped cloud of fluff at its top, and a string-like appendage that hangs down. It is extremely cute. Its Pokédex entry in Pokémon Sun reads, "Stories go that it grabs the hands of small children and drags them away to the afterlife. It dislikes heavy children." The final sentence is doing something remarkable. After stating directly that this creature kidnaps children and takes them to the afterlife, the Pokédex notes that it prefers lighter children because they are easier to carry. This is delivered without comment, without the hedging language of it is said or legends claim. It is presented as a straightforward biological observation. Drifloon dislikes heavy children. This is simply a fact about Drifloon. The dissonance between the cuteness of Drifloon's design and the matter-of-factness of its described behavior is the point. The Pokémon world is full of extremely appealing creatures that are doing or have done or will do things that, thought about carefully, are genuinely frightening. A balloon that takes children to the afterlife is not frightening in the way that a predator is frightening. It is frightening in the way that something that disguises danger as delight is frightening. The child reaches for the balloon because it is bright and cheerful, and seems like exactly the kind of thing that should be held. And the Pokédex, recording this information, does not editorialize. It simply notes, it dislikes heavy children. Duskull, introduced in Generation 3, is a small, skull-faced ghost type that wanders at night, specifically targeting children who misbehave. Its Pokédex entry reads, "If it finds bad children who won't listen to their parents, it will spirit them away, or so it's said." The "or so it's said" is the hedge, but it is a notably light one for a creature that the entry immediately follows with the information that Duskull has a habit of following chosen targets for days without breaking off. The cultural echo here is deep. The creature that takes bad children away is one of the oldest and most widespread disciplinary figures in human mythology across many cultures. Duskull is the Pokémon world's incarnation of a warning that human parents have been giving children for longer than writing exists. Its evolved form, Dusknor, is described as a grim reaper figure that receives radio signals from the spirit world and uses them to guide the dead. Its entry in Heart Gold and Soul Silver states that it takes those led astray by its guiding to the spirit world. Whether these are willing travelers or not is left to the imagination. Spoink is perhaps the most quietly devastating of the ghost-adjacent creatures, though it is not itself a ghost type. Spoink is a psychic type that bounces constantly on its spring-like tail. It must bounce continuously because the bouncing pumps its heart, and if it stops bouncing, it dies. The Pokédex adds, across various entries, that Spoink is constantly searching for a pearl to wear on its head, because the pearl amplifies its psychic powers, and that when it loses its pearl it becomes frantic and searches desperately until it finds a new one or a substitute. There is nothing supernatural or horrifying about Spoink the way there is about Drifloon or Phantump. But the image of a creature that cannot stop moving because stopping means death, searching always for the thing that makes it more fully itself, going frantic when that thing is lost, is its own kind of sadness. The Dark Pokédex entries are not confined to ghost types. Parasect is a bug type that the Pokédex describes as having had its consciousness completely taken over by the mushroom growing on its back, with no independent will remaining. The mushroom is in control. What you battle when you battle Parasect is not Parasect at all. It is a fungus wearing the body of a creature it colonized and consumed. The eyes of Parasect are blank white because nothing is looking out from behind them. Gengar's entries in recent games have softened its portrayal slightly, leaning into the idea that it is a mischievous trickster rather than a predatory haunter. But earlier entries are more direct. Gengar lurks in shadows and lowers the temperature of its surroundings by 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Its body temperature is described as absolute zero. It enjoys frightening people, particularly in their own homes at night, in the corners where shadows pool. It is described in one entry as having once been human, looking for a chance to steal the life of a living person. The cheerful smile on Gengar's face, the grinning expression that has made it one of the most beloved Pokémon in the franchise, reads differently after you have spent enough time with those entries. That smile has always known something you do not. The ghost-type Pokémon of the franchise form a mythology unto themselves, one that is specifically about the boundary between life and death, about the things that linger when they should not, about the parts of human experience that culture assigns to shadows and whispers. They are the Pokémon world's honest acknowledgement that the world contains not only adventure and friendship and competition, but also loss and grief and the unresolved things that loss leaves behind. The game does not spend a lot of time on this acknowledgement. It delivers it in small doses, in the space of a Pokédex entry, in the brief description attached to a creature that you might otherwise simply train and use in battles without looking closely. But for the players who do look closely, who read the entries and follow the threads and sit with the implications, the Pokémon world becomes something richer and stranger and more honest than it initially appears. Section 9. The Dragon That Was Too Reshiram, Zekrom, and the Problem of Kyurem. The Unova region is based on New York and its surroundings. Its cities are modeled on the boroughs of the city, its geography stretched and rearranged, but clearly drawing on the particular energy of a place built by competing forces trying to occupy the same space. Pokémon Black and White were released in Japan in 2010 and internationally in 2011, and they arrived with an explicit goal that the creative team discussed publicly: to introduce a new generation of Pokémon without relying on the nostalgia that had been a significant part of the franchise's continuing appeal. No Kanto Pokémon were available in the main game. The Unova region was a fresh start. They also arrived with the most philosophically ambitious story the main series games had told up to that point, and the legendary Pokémon at its heart were built to carry that ambition. Before there was the Unova region, according to the myths preserved there was the original dragon. Not a dragon in the sense of a species, or even in the sense of a legendary Pokémon. The original dragon was something that predated those categories, a single entity of extraordinary power that contained within itself both truth and ideals, both the reality of what is and the aspiration for what should be, balanced in a single being. Two heroic brothers used the original dragon's power to create the Unova region, shaping the land from nothing the way that Groudon and Kyogre had shaped Hoenn, but through human agency and the assistance of a divine being, rather than through the inherent will of the beings themselves. Then the brothers had a disagreement. The older brother valued truth. He believed that an understanding of reality as it actually is, without projection or desire or the distortion of hope, was the foundation of wisdom and right action. You must see clearly, he argued, to act rightly. The younger brother valued ideals. He believed that reality as it is never sufficient, that the imagination of what could be, the burning insistence that the world should be better than it is, and the commitment to making it so, is the source of all meaningful action. You must have vision, he argued, to act at all. These are not stupid positions. They are not easily dismissed. The history of human thought is full of versions of this argument, between those who believe that clear-eyed acceptance of what is constitutes wisdom and those who believe that refusal to accept what is constitutes justice. The argument has never been resolved. It runs through politics and philosophy and ethics and every domain of human life, in which people must decide how to act in a difficult world. The original dragon, presented with the irreconcilable positions of its two masters, could not hold together. It split. Reshiram emerged from the split as the dragon of truth. It took the side of the older brother, the one who sought clear seeing. Its body is white, its plumage flowing, and it controls fire, not the destructive fire of battle but the fire of purification and illumination, the fire that burns away obscuring material to reveal what lies beneath. Its signature ability is called Turbo Blaze, which allows its attacks to bypass any protective ability, to strike through defenses because truth cannot be stopped by the refusal to look. Its Pokédex describes it as assisting heroes who seek the truth, appearing to those who pursue it with sincere hearts. Zekrom emerged as the dragon of ideals. It took the side of the younger brother, the one who believed that the better world must be imagined before it can be built. Its body is black, armored, and heavy, and it controls electricity, the force that drives transformation. That is the difference between a machine at rest and a machine in motion. It is the energy of becoming rather than being. Its signature ability is called Terravolt, which works the same way as Turbo Blaze. It strikes through defenses, because ideals pursued with genuine commitment also cannot be stopped by refusal. Its Pokédex describes it as assisting heroes who pursue their ideals. Neither Reshiram nor Zekrom is presented as correct. This is the most important single detail of the Tao Trio's mythology, and it is not always acknowledged clearly in discussion of Pokémon Black and White. The game does not tell you that the older brother was right and the younger was wrong, or vice versa. It does not tell you that truth is more important than ideals, or that ideals are more important than truth. It gives you Reshiram and it gives you Zekrom, and it allows each of them to be equally powerful, equally valid, equally deserving of respect, because the argument between them is genuinely unsettled. The Pokémon world does not resolve it for you. You choose a side by choosing which version of the game to play, and that choice determines which dragon you encounter first. But the other dragon is still there, still real, still as powerful as the one you chose. The third member of the Tao Trio is Kyurem, and Kyurem is what remains. When the original dragon split into Reshiram and Zekrom, something was left over. The emptiness that had been between truth and ideals, the absence that separated them, the space that existed where the connection had been. Kyurem is that space made physical. It is a dragon of ice and dragon typing, and its body looks incomplete in ways that Reshiram and Zekrom do not. One wing is shorter than the other, its tail seems to be missing something, its mouth is frozen shut by the cold it generates. It looks like the remnant of something larger, because it is. The mythology of Kyurem is built on an idea from Taoist philosophy, the concept of wuji. If yang it is active, positive, light, and yin is passive, receptive, dark, then wuji is the state before the distinction, the void from which yin and yang emerge. Reshiram is yang. Zekrom is yin. Kyurem is wuji, the absence, the potential, the incomplete thing that waits to be filled. The Pokédex says Kyurem waits for a hero to fill in the missing parts of its body with truth or ideals. And in Pokémon Black 2 and White 2, this literally happens. Kyurem can fuse with either Reshiram or Zekrom using an item called the DNA splicers, becoming White Kyurem fused with Reshiram, or Black Kyurem fused with Zekrom. In these forms, it is not a new thing, but a partial restoration, a fragment of the original dragon reunited with part of what it had been. The fusion forms are visually and mechanically more powerful than the base Kyurem, and they have a quality of wrongness that feels appropriate. They are not balanced, because truth and ideals are still not balanced. They are just what happens when one is added back to the remnant. In a legend recorded at Lacunosa Town in the Unova region, there is an alternate and contradictory account of Kyurem's origin, that it fell from the sky in an icy meteor, that it crawled from the crater and began preying on people and Pokémon, and that the townspeople built a wall around their settlement to keep it out. In this version, Kyurem is alien, not the remnant of a split, but something that came from outside. The contradiction is left unresolved, and both stories coexist in the game's mythology, which is, again, exactly how real mythologies behave. History that has been long enough gets retold, and the retellings diverge, and by the time anyone is recording them, they have both been true for too long to dismiss either. The antagonist of Pokémon Black and White, N, is one of the most unusual Pokémon villains in the franchise's history, in part because his argument is not incoherent. N was raised by the villain Getsis to believe that the relationship between Pokémon and humans is inherently exploitative, that Pokémon cannot truly consent to being caught and trained, and that the only ethical resolution is to liberate all Pokémon from human control. This argument is never definitively refuted by the game. Instead, the player character's genuine bond with their Pokémon, the relationship built through the game's events, is presented as a counterexample. Here is a relationship that does not appear to be exploitation. The game's position is not that N is entirely wrong, but that the specific policy he proposes, the complete separation of Pokémon from human society, does not follow from his premises. N's alignment with Zekrom in Black or Reshiram in White is determined by which game you are playing, which means that in one version, N pursues ideals, and in the other, he seeks truth. The game suggests that N is wrong not because he pursued the wrong value, but because the pursuit, divorced from its counterpart, becomes destructive. Ideals without truth become fanaticism. Truth without ideals becomes a justification for what is. The original dragon was powerful because it contained both. The split weakened it. The lesson is not subtle. You need both. This is the most philosophically engaged the main series games have ever been, and it is mostly delivered through the mythology of 3 dragon-type Pokémon and a villain whose argument deserves more consideration than most of his predecessors. Kyurem remains in the giant chasm of Unova, alone, waiting. Its body still incomplete, its mouth still frozen, its wings still asymmetrical. It generates cold so intense that it can freeze the surrounding area even on warm days. The Lacanosa town legend says it ate people. The creation myth says it is the remnant of something divine. Both of these things may be true simultaneously. A being that is holy in its origin and terrible in its hunger, incomplete in its existence and dangerous in its incompleteness. Section 10. The secrets within the code-scrapped Pokémon, lost episodes, and hidden worlds. The Pokémon franchise has now produced more than 27 years of games, anime, manga, trading cards, and supplementary media. In that time, the people creating all of that content have had ideas that never made it into the final product. Some were scrapped for reasons of time. Some were cut for reasons of hardware limitation. Some were removed because playtesting revealed problems that could not be fixed within the production schedule. And some remain in the finished games, buried in the code, accessible only to people willing to look for them, visible evidence of roads not taken. Missing No is the most famous of these, and its fame is entirely appropriate because it is one of the strangest cases in gaming history. Most players who encountered it in Pokémon Red and Blue did so through the Old Man glitch, talking to the old man in Viridian City who teaches you how to catch a Pokémon, then flying to Cinnabar Island and surfing along the eastern coast. The game's memory, in storing the old man's name during the catching tutorial, briefly overwrites data in a way that causes the wild Pokémon encounter system to load entries it is not supposed to load. Missing No is what the game generates when it tries to display data for a Pokémon that does not exist. It uses the player's name characters as a species, which produces a glitched sprite, a name that says Missing No, and properties that vary based on what the player's name happens to contain. The reason Missing No has the particular properties it does, and specifically the reason it duplicates items in the 6th inventory slot when encountered, is a consequence of how the game stores data about the last encounter. The item duplication is not intentional. It is a side effect of the memory corruption that encountering a non-existent Pokémon causes. The game was designed with placeholder entries to prevent crashes when the Pokédex encountered empty index positions. Missing No is that placeholder, visible only through specific glitch conditions, given form by the accident of the player's name. This is actually what makes Missing No more interesting than simple mythology. It is not a hidden Pokémon placed by developers as an Easter egg. It is an artifact of the game's own structure made accidentally visible. It is the framework of the game looking at itself. In Pokémon Gold and Silver, the data miners who have explored the game's code over the years discovered something unexpected: a Safari Zone area that exists in the code but cannot be accessed through normal gameplay. The Johto games do not include a Safari Zone in their main content, but the data for one is present: maps and encounter tables and all the mechanical infrastructure needed for the feature to function, simply unreachable without manipulating the game's memory or using cheat devices. Why this data is present is a question that the development history does not fully answer. The most likely explanation is that a Safari Zone was planned for Johto, included in early development builds, and cut late enough in production that removing the data would have been more disruptive than simply making it inaccessible. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remakes released in 2009, did include a Safari Zone in Johto, in a form significantly more elaborate than anything suggested by the scrapped data. Whether this was Game Freak's way of returning to an old idea or simply a fresh decision to include the feature in a remake is unknown. The unused music in Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire is another category of hidden content that has fascinated researchers for years. Several music tracks exist within the game's data that are never played during normal gameplay. One in particular, an eerie and somewhat discordant piece, has been the subject of sustained speculation about its intended use. A scrapped cave? A haunted location that was designed and then removed? The tracks are too well composed to be accidental, too specific in tone to be placeholder content. They suggest a location with a particular atmosphere that was planned and then abandoned, leaving only its soundtrack behind. The Battle Frontier in Pokémon Emerald contains a slot machine mechanic, and buried in the code of that mechanic is a 1 in 65,000 chance event. If the slot machines line up in a specific improbable configuration, the game generates an Easter egg message that congratulates the player. This message was never discovered through normal play. It was found by data miners running through the game's code systematically, or by players using emulators to manipulate the random number generator. The probability of encountering it through genuine play is so low that it was effectively a secret that the developers hid, knowing it might never be found. The Mew glitch, distinct from Missing No, is perhaps the most remarkable piece of unintended game design in the franchise's history. Through a specific sequence of actions involving trainer battles and the fly move, it is possible in the original Red and Blue games to manipulate the game's encounter data in such a way that a wild Mew appears. Mew is presented publicly as unobtainable in the retail versions of the games, available only through official Nintendo events. The Mew glitch, discovered and spread through playground rumor networks in the late 1990s, allowed players to encounter the mythical Pokémon without any special event. The glitch is real, it works, and it works because of a specific quirk of how the game stores encounter data in relation to trainer line-of-sight triggers. A quirk that was not intentional, but has been thoroughly understood by the fan community. The banned anime episodes of the franchise form their own category of hidden lore, content that exists and has been seen but not widely enough to enter the mainstream understanding of the series. The Legend of Dratini is the most significant of these. An episode set in the Safari Zone that features trainers and guards pointing firearms directly at Ash and his friends. The episode was never dubbed into English. It contains, as a detail that flew entirely under the radar for most Western fans, the revelation that the Safari Zone's warden owns a Dragonite, one of the rarest and most powerful Pokémon in Kanto, which would have been a significant reveal if the episode had aired internationally. Instead, it became a gap in the English-language continuity, a story that happened in Japan and nowhere else. The Electric Soldier Porygon episode is better known in the West, for all the wrong reasons. Broadcast in Japan in December 1997, the episode used a rapid alternation of red and blue flashing lights during an action sequence. The lights triggered photosensitive epileptic seizures in approximately 685 viewers, leading to the episode being withdrawn immediately and all subsequent Pokémon anime episodes being delayed for 4 months, while the production company implemented new guidelines for broadcast animation. The episode was never dubbed into English and has never been rebroadcast anywhere. The strange aftermath of the Porygon episode is that Porygon, the digital Pokémon that was the focus of the episode's story, was essentially barred from future anime appearances, even though the seizure-inducing flash was technically caused by an attack from Ash's Pikachu, not by Porygon's actions. Porygon and its evolutionary forms, Porygon 2 and Porygon Z, have appeared in minor background roles and promotional materials, but have never again been featured in a speaking or action role in the main anime series. The Pokémon was punished by association, which is precisely the kind of irrational but persistent consequence that real-world controversies produce. The scrapped features visible in the code across multiple games paint a picture of what the franchise might have been at various points. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl contains data for an unused alarm clock app in the Pokétch device, which would have allowed players to set a real-world alarm that triggered one of the game's sound cues at a chosen time. Pokémon Sun and Moon contains unused text from Lusamine, referencing the Ultra Beasts in ways that suggest they were originally conceived as unique, singular entities rather than species with multiple catchable individuals. Pokémon Black and White contains early design materials and unused dialogue that suggests Team Plasma's antagonism was originally significantly more morally ambiguous, with some gym leaders privately agreeing with N's arguments about Pokémon liberation. The Eevee evolution that was never made is one of the most discussed pieces of scrapped content from the franchise's development history. Early design sketches from the production of Gold and Silver show concepts for additional evolutions beyond Espeon and Umbreon. One of these is described in various accounts as a darker evolution, one that would have been achieved through low friendship rather than high friendship, the opposite of Espeon and Umbreon's happiness-based evolutions. What this Pokémon would have been called, what it would have looked like, and what its typing might have been are all unknown. The concept did not progress past the sketching stage, but its implied existence, an Eevee evolution that grows powerful through alienation rather than love, is philosophically interesting in ways that the franchise has not revisited with a main series evolution. The Cubone origin story has a fan theory associated with it that has proven extremely persistent, despite never being confirmed by Game Freak. The idea that Cubone is actually a Kangaskhan baby, and that the skull it wears belongs to a Kangaskhan mother. Kangaskhan is a Pokémon that always carries its baby in its pouch. In the original games, Kangaskhan babies are not separately obtainable as wild Pokémon. There is no baby Kangaskhan. The skull Cubone wears is never explicitly identified as belonging to a specific species. The geographic range in which Cubone and Kangaskhan can be found in the Safari Zone overlaps. The theory does not hold together under rigorous examination, but it has the quality of feeling true in a way that official facts sometimes do not, and that feeling is itself interesting. It suggests that the franchise's willingness to leave things unstated creates spaces that the imagination fills with stories that resonate more deeply than confirmed facts might. Pokémon Snap, the N64 game that casts the player as a photographer on an island nature preserve, contains in its code references to a Lapras riding mechanic that would have allowed the player to approach water-type Pokémon from the water rather than from the shore. The mechanic was cut before release, discovered by data miners years later. Its presence suggests an ambition for the game that the final release only partially fulfilled, and explains certain oddities in the island's geography that seem designed to accommodate an approach angle that no longer exists in the game. The Game Freak tradition of leaving scrapped content in the code rather than removing it has been a gift to the fan community. Every generation of games contains evidence of what the developers were thinking during production, which features they pursued and abandoned, which Pokémon were designed and then cut, which locations were planned and then removed. This record of intention and revision gives the franchise a kind of archaeological richness. Even the games that were released are surrounded by the ghosts of the games that were almost released, and those ghosts tell their own story about the creative process that produced what we actually got. The most poignant of these absences for many fans is the Pokémon that were designed for Gold and Silver's roster but cut before release. Among these was a small electric tiger cub called Kutura in some accounts, a bear-like creature, and several others whose designs exist only as sprites in leaked pre-release data. These Pokémon were created. They have designs and types and presumably names. They simply did not make it into the final product. Somewhere in the history of development decisions made under time pressure and memory constraints on aging hardware, they were removed. And now they exist only as data in pre-release builds and as objects of speculation about what Generation 2 might have been with 30 more species in it. Section 11. The real world that Pokémon built. The franchise that Satoshi Tajiri created in the image of his childhood bug collecting has, over its 3 decades, done something to the world that is difficult to describe without resorting to superlatives. Not because the franchise is simply popular, though it is. With over 440 million games sold and billions of trading cards distributed, it is one of the most commercially successful properties in human history. But because the franchise has changed things outside its own boundaries in ways that are measurable and specific, the Game Boy was not a cutting-edge piece of hardware when Pokémon Red and Green released in 1996. It was 8 years old. Nintendo's hardware strategy at the time was focused on the Super Nintendo and preparations for the N64. The Game Boy was considered a legacy product. The success of Pokémon changed its trajectory entirely. Suddenly, an aging handheld was selling in numbers that surprised everyone, including Nintendo, because children who needed to be able to trade Pokémon required a Game Boy, and many of them were buying one specifically for that purpose. The link cable as social technology is something that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The link cable connecting two Game Boys was a physical object, a wire that required two people to be in the same place at the same time. You could not trade Pokémon over the internet. You could not trade Pokémon from your bedroom at 2 in the morning. You had to be present. Physically proximate to another person who also had a Game Boy and the games, the culture that grew up around Pokémon trading in the late 1990s was a face-to-face culture, a schoolyard culture, a culture of small negotiations and specific knowledge, and the particular satisfaction of finally getting the Pokémon you had been searching for from someone who needed the one you had been willing to trade. This is the thing that Tajiri saw when he looked at the link cable and understood the game he wanted to make. The cable was a metaphor that also happened to be physically real. It forced social interaction. It required presence. It was, in its small and specific way, a digital recapitulation of the experience of trading insects in a field in Machida 30 years before. The internet changed the social infrastructure of the franchise irrevocably, and not always in ways that made things better. The GTS, the global trade system introduced in Diamond and Pearl, allowed players to trade with anyone in the world without being in the same room. This is a genuine improvement over the constraints of the link cable in terms of access and convenience. But something was also lost. The face-to-face negotiation, the schoolyard ecosystem of knowledge and dealing, the specific social ritual that the original games had been designed around. Pokémon Go, released in 2016, was in many ways an attempt to recreate the original social experience of the franchise in a modern technological context. The game used GPS and augmented reality to place Pokémon in real-world locations, requiring players to physically go to those locations to catch them. Pokéstops required physical presence. Gyms, in the original gym system before the game's first major revision, required physically being there. In the first weeks and months after the game's launch, before its various technical problems became the dominant story, it created something genuinely remarkable. Mass gatherings of people in public spaces, drawn together by the shared experience of chasing digital creatures through physical streets, talking to strangers because the strangers were doing the same thing. There were documented cases in that period of people who had been largely socially isolated, finding their way into communities through the shared activity of Pokémon Go. The game's structure made conversations natural in a way that social interaction between strangers is usually not. You are both clearly doing the same thing. You have something to talk about. The talk requires no preamble. It is again a digital version of what happens when two children are both looking for insects in the same field. The franchise's handling of themes around disability, mental health, and social difficulty has become more explicit in recent generations. Pokémon Legends, Arceus, released in 2022, features a protagonist who falls from the modern world into the ancient Hisui region and must build trust with a community that initially does not accept them. The game is unusually interested in the experience of being an outsider who must prove themselves, and in the patience that this process requires. It is not a direct allegory for any specific experience, but players who have felt like outsiders have found it resonant. The trading card game, launched alongside the anime and games in 1998, became its own cultural phenomenon with dynamics that were largely separate from the games themselves. The schoolyard card economy of the late 1990s and early 2000s was a complete ecosystem. Information about card rarity was currency. The ability to evaluate cards quickly and accurately was a skill, and the social capital attached to owning particular cards was real. A first edition holographic Charizard was not simply a piece of cardboard with art on it. It was a status object, a proof of having and knowing something rare, the direct descendant of the rare beetle in the glass jar. The contemporary Pokémon card market, which has exploded in the years since 2020, is a continuation and amplification of those original dynamics. Cards that were worth a few dollars in 1999 are worth thousands now. First edition sealed boxes have sold at auction for amounts in the hundreds of thousands. Professional grading services for Pokémon cards have waiting lists measured in months. This is simultaneously absurd and entirely consistent with the franchise's foundational logic. Rarity has always been part of the appeal, the thrill of having something that not everyone has, the joy of the complete collection, and the specific pleasure of the thing that was hardest to get. The music of the Pokémon games, composed primarily by Junichi Masuda in the early generations, has had a cultural reach that extends well beyond the games themselves. Remixes and arrangements of Game Boy-era Pokémon music appear in orchestra concerts, jazz performances, electronic music productions, and soundscapes designed for relaxation and study. The original compositions, despite their technical simplicity, have a melodic quality that has proven extremely durable. The Pokémon Center theme is recognizable to an entire generation of players in a way that produces a specific emotional response. A warmth, a sense of safety, the feeling of having arrived somewhere that will restore what was lost. This is no small thing for a piece of music to accomplish, and it accomplished it entirely accidentally through the association between the music and the emotional experience of the game rather than through any design intention. The franchise's influence on the development of media aimed at children in the late 1990s and early 2000s is visible but difficult to quantify precisely. The monster-catching and battling genre that Pokémon pioneered spawned an enormous number of imitators, some successful and some less so. Digimon, Bakugan, Beyblade, and many others occupy a conceptual space that would not have existed without Pokémon having established the basic appeal of collectible creatures that can be both friends and fighters. Even outside the direct imitators, the influence on how children's media handles concepts like strategy, collection, and social competition is visible in things that do not obviously look like Pokémon at all. What Satoshi Tajiri actually built, when he took the memory of catching bugs in Machida and the image of two Game Boys connected by a wire and spent 6 years making the game that would very nearly bankrupt his company, was not simply a franchise. He built a world, and the world he built has been inhabited by enough people for long enough that it has become part of the fabric of things, one of those cultural objects so familiar that it is difficult to remember what existed in its place before. That world has creation myths and ghost stories. It has ancient ruins and buried mysteries. It has Pokémon who were once human and dragons that split apart over the oldest of all arguments, and a town where a mother's ghost waited for her child. It has a god in an egg and a mediator in the sky, and 3 beasts made from the ashes of a tower that burned down 300 years before the story started. It is an extraordinarily rich, imaginary world. And the people who have spent their lives in it, through the games and the anime and the cards and all the other forms it has taken, have found things in it that they would not have found anywhere else. Knowledge of its history, comfort in its landscapes, company in its characters, the particular companionship of caring about something collectively, of sharing the world with other people who know it as well as you do. This is, perhaps, the deepest level on which Tajiri succeeded. Not in the commercial sense, extraordinary as that has been, not in the cultural sense, significant as that is, but in the sense that the thing he made to share the experience of searching through tall grass for something alive, genuinely gives that experience to the people who encounter it. The games still feel like searching. The rare Pokémon still feel rare. The legendary encounters still feel significant, even now, even after 30 years of them. The world he built from a memory of a field is still there, still expanding with each new generation of games, still containing things that have not been found yet, and questions that have not been answered yet, and myths that have not been fully explored yet. There is always more to find. Section 12. The Long Rest. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight, more than I can summarize cleanly, and I suspect that is right. Some of what we have talked about does not resolve into neat summary. The Unown do not resolve. Mewtwo does not resolve. The question of what the ruins of Alph were built for does not resolve. These are open spaces in the mythology, placed there deliberately because an imaginary world that answers all its own questions is a smaller world than one that knows how to leave things unknown. What I hope you take from this as you settle in and let the words become less distinct is the sense of scale. Not the commercial scale, though that is genuinely extraordinary. The mythological scale. The scale of a world that contains a god in an egg who made time and space with 1,000 arms, and an ancient battle between land and sea that created the ground under your feet, and a rainbow bird searching the world for a pure heart, and a town where people go to grieve their companions, and a manufactured creature wrestling with the question of what it means to exist without having agreed to, and small ghost Pokémon shaped like letters who may or may not be the language in which the universe was written. All of that lives in the same fictional world as Pikachu, as the cheerful music of Pallet Town and the optimism of every new beginning with a new starter Pokémon in a new region. The Pokémon world is both of those things simultaneously: the bright surface and the deep, strange darkness below it, the accessible adventure and the myth underneath the adventure, the child's game and the adult story that the child's game has been quietly telling for 3 decades. Satoshi Tajiri, the boy who caught insects in a field that no longer exists, built a world that does. And the world he built is large enough and strange enough and rich enough that it rewards attention even now, even after all this time, even after all the stories it has already told. There are still Unown hidden in hard-to-reach places. There is still a dragon waiting in the giant chasm with its mouth frozen shut. There is still a rainbow bird searching for a pure heart somewhere over the horizon. The next time you close your eyes, perhaps it will fly over wherever you are, trailing color across the sky, visible for just a moment before it is gone. Sleep well, and thank you for spending this time in the world with me. If you enjoyed this video, I would love it if you hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a new video. Drop a comment and let me know which piece of Pokémon lore sat with you the longest tonight. And I will see you in the next one. End of script. Section 13. Stars and Stolen Light. The Alola mythology and the Light Trio. There is an archipelago in the Pokémon world that feels different from every other region that came before it. The Alola region, inspired by the Hawaiian Islands, is built around a relationship between land and sea and sky that runs deeper than geography, shaped by ancient mythology still alive in the culture of the people who live there, still honored in the rituals of the island guardians, still visible in the ruins that dot each island if you know where to look. It is a region with legends that feel genuinely sacred, not just old. The 4 islands of Alola are each watched over by a Tapu, a guardian deity of the land. Tapu Koko watches Melemele Island, a small, electric and fairy-type Pokémon that crackles with restless energy and has a history of testing the people it protects, pushing them towards strength rather than simply sheltering them. Tapu Lele watches Akala Island, psychic and fairy, its scale-like wings showering the ground with scales that carry both healing power and poison, a guardian whose care manifests as challenge. Tapu Bulu watches Ula Ula Island, grass and fairy, slow and deliberate, connected to the land in the most literal sense, said to be capable of making trees grow by sheer will. And Tapu Fini watches Pony Island, water and fairy, inhabiting the sea mists of the most remote island, its heart sealed away from humans by a mist maze that only the truly worthy can navigate, because Tapu Fini has been hurt by those who came seeking its power, and it protects itself now by remaining always slightly just out of reach. These 4 guardians are connected to an ancient mythology that precedes them, or at least precedes their current roles. According to a book found in the library of Mali City, called The Light of Alola, something came to the islands very long ago through a rift in the sky, an opening between worlds that the Alola people eventually came to call ultra wormholes. What came through was described as either the beast that devours the sun or the beast that calls the moon, depending on the version of the story. Solgaleo or Lunala, or perhaps both, in different tellings of the same event. The 4 Tapus battled this being that had arrived from elsewhere. They fought it, and they lost. And the entity, victorious, chose not to destroy the islands, but instead gifted the Tapus a treasure, a crystalline substance called Tapunium Z, and departed. What this encounter reveals about the nature of power in the Alola mythology is interesting. The guardian deities of the land can be defeated by something that comes from outside. The protection of the islands is real but not absolute, and the victor in that ancient battle chose to honor the defeated rather than destroy them. The mythology continues with the description of the being creating several small forms of itself, known as Cosmog, and entrusting them to the care of the Tapus, with instructions to watch over these fragile heirs until they had grown into their full power. The ancient kings of Alola, in gratitude, created 2 instruments, the Sun Flute and the moon flute, which, when played together at the altar of the Sunne, or the altar of the moon, could facilitate the evolution of Cosmoem into its final form. Cosmog is an extraordinary concept. It is a tiny nebula, a wisp of cosmic material in the shape of a small Pokémon, with eyes that contain tiny star clusters. Its Pokédex description calls it the child of the stars. It is incapable of battle, too small and too young, and it is described as emitting a faint light that people in ancient times found comforting. It collects small scraps of other things that drift near it, the way a nebula collects gas and dust, and these fragments gradually coalesce around it as it grows. The evolutionary line that Cosmog describes is literally the life cycle of a star. Cosmog is a molecular cloud, Cosmoem is a protostar in the compression phase, and Sol Galeo and Lunala are the main sequence stars that the protostar eventually becomes. This is genuinely elegant design. The Pokémon evolutionary mechanic, which generally represents maturation, is in this case actually mapped onto astrophysics. Cosmog does not grow up. It undergoes stellar evolution, and Solgaleo and Lunala are not simply two alternate evolved forms of the same Pokémon in the conventional sense. They are two different kinds of star, representing two different astronomical objects, body and spirit, sun and moon, the visible light of day and the borrowed light of night. Solgaleo is a psychic and steel type, a massive lion-like creature whose mane forms the shape of a stylized sun. It is called the beast that devours the sun because it is understood in the Alola mythology not simply as drawing on solar power, but as consuming it, taking the sun's energy into itself and radiating it outward so that its presence makes night look like noon. Its steel typing in the context of the mythology represents physicality, material existence, the body as opposed to the spirit. Lunala is a psychic and ghost type, a vast bat-like creature whose wingspan seems to contain stars within it, whose presence causes the sky around it to darken, who creates the full moon by letting the light it has gathered shine out all at once. It is called the beast that calls the moon. Its ghost typing represents the immaterial, the spirit, the things that exist beyond the physical. In the design language of the light trio, Solgaleo is matter and Lunala is spirit, and Cosmog is the potential from which either can emerge depending on the circumstances. Necrozma is the third member of the light trio, and Necrozma is where the mythology of Alola becomes genuinely dark. In its base form, Necrozma is a black crystalline creature with a design that resembles a prism, angular and fractured, with lights that do not come from within it but seem to be caught inside it the way light is caught inside a crystal. It is not a native Pokémon of the Alola region, and it is not an Ultra Beast in the official classification, though it has connections to Ultra Space. Its Pokédex entries describe it as having originally been made of light, as having been shattered long ago and left unable to generate its own light, as preying on Solgaleo and Lunala specifically to steal the light it can no longer produce on its own. This backstory, developed primarily in Pokémon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, is one of the more genuinely tragic pieces of legendary lore in the franchise. Necrozma was once, like Solgaleo and Lunala, a being of pure light. Something broke it. The games do not fully explain what, but the implication is that something attacked or fundamentally damaged Necrozma long ago, shattering its ability to generate light on its own. What was left was a form that could only exist by taking light from others, a black crystal that steals the brightness from the world around it, not out of malice, but out of need. In Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, Necrozma is the primary antagonist, fusing with Solgaleo or Lunala to drain the light of the Alola region. The Ultra Recon Squad, a group of people from a world that Necrozma had previously consumed all the light from, explains the scale of the threat. When Necrozma drains all the light from a world, that world does not survive. They have been searching for a way to save their own world by appeasing or healing Necrozma, and their approach is one of the more morally complex angles the franchise has taken on a villain. They understand what Necrozma is doing, and they also understand why. And they have spent considerable effort trying to address the root cause, rather than simply fighting the symptom. The resolution involves restoring Necrozma to its original form, Ultra Necrozma, a transformation that requires collecting an enormous amount of Z-power and allowing Necrozma to fully awaken. In its Ultra form, Necrozma is no longer black. It blazes with golden light, its fractured crystal body revealed as the source of all its stolen radiance, its true form as a being of pure illumination finally visible. It is both the most powerful and the most beautiful version of the Pokémon, and the contrast with its hunched, darkness-consuming base form is one of the most visually striking transformations in the franchise. The mythology of Alola is the most explicitly cosmological of any regional mythology in the franchise, engaged with questions of stellar evolution and the nature of light in ways that feel both scientifically informed and genuinely mythological. It is a region where the ancient stories and the scientific explanations are not in conflict, but are different languages describing the same things, and the game navigates between them with unusual grace. Section 14. The Fog Between Worlds. Ghost towns, haunted routes, and the quiet horrors. There is a route in the Kalos region, the region based on France, that is simply called the Lost Hotel. It is not a hotel anymore, by the time the player encounters it, if it ever was one in the conventional sense. It is a sprawling, broken structure built into the rock of a cliff top. Its interior dark and damp, inhabited by wild Pokémon that prefer the shadows, and by a small community of trainers who style themselves as punk characters and who seem to have found a kind of home in the ruin. The route leading to it has a fog effect applied to it that obscures the path, and the music that plays while navigating it is specifically designed to evoke the feeling of somewhere that has been abandoned for longer than memory can account for. The Kalos region is, in general terms, a region comfortable with ruin. The lore that surrounds it is concerned with loss and legacy in ways that the earlier regions were not. The war that devastated the region 3,000 years before the events of Pokémon X and Y, the war that AZ's Floette went to fight and did not return from, the war that AZ ended by constructing a weapon that restored his lost Pokémon and destroyed everything else, left marks on the landscape that are still visible millennia later. The power plant on Route 13, ruined and silent. The Lost Hotel on Route 15. The underground tunnels near Laver City. Kalos is a region built on the bones of something that burned. AZ's story is told in fragments, delivered by non-player characters and by AZ himself in the closing sequence of the game. He is a man over 3,000 years old, preserved by the machine he built, walking the world in a state that is not quite grief and not quite guilt but contains elements of both. His Floette went to war and died. He built a weapon from the life energy of Pokémon, converting that energy into enough power to end the war, and as a side effect used some of that power to restore his Floette. His Floette, revived, learned what the weapon had done, and Floette left. It has not returned in 3,000 years. AZ's Floette is officially an unobtainable Pokémon. Players cannot acquire it through legitimate gameplay. Its data exists in X and Y, its design visible, and its stats accessible through data mining. But there is no event, no distribution, no in-game method by which the player can obtain the specific Floette that AZ lost. In the post-game, AZ appears on a hill and reaches out toward the sky, and his Floette appears and approaches him, and the two are reunited. The player cannot catch this Floette. It is not a battle. It is simply the closure of a story that has been running for 3,000 years. This is a remarkable design choice. Most legendary encounters in the franchise offer the player the chance to capture the being involved. The AZ's Floette scene offers nothing mechanically. It is pure story, pure resolution, a moment in which the game says, "This is not for you. This belongs to these two characters. Watch and then let them have it." The fog routes of various regions deserve particular attention. There is something about fog in the Pokémon games that activates a specific kind of unease. In the original Pokémon games, the fog move was exclusive to Pokémon Tower in Lavender Town, where its mechanical purpose of reducing accuracy was married to the thematic purpose of representing the difficulty of seeing clearly in a haunted place. Later games expanded the fog to outdoor routes, most famously in Diamond and Pearl's route, 210 north of Celestic Town, where the fog is thick enough to reduce visibility significantly and can only be dispelled using the HMD fog. Celestic Town itself is one of the quietest but richest pieces of lore delivery in the 4th-generation games. It is a very old village, the oldest in Sinnoh, and its residents understand themselves as custodians of an ancient heritage. The ruins at its center contain drawings of Dialga, Palkia, and a third creature that some residents describe as the other world's Pokémon, Giratina, depicted in a cave drawing long before Giratina is formally revealed to the player. The Elder of Celestic Town, Cynthia's grandmother, has been studying these ruins for years and has accumulated a knowledge of Sinnoh's prehistoric mythology that the game makes available to the player in small, deliberate pieces. The fog that surrounds Celestic Town on its approach is not just inclement weather. It is the landscape matching the theme. You are approaching a place that is partly in the present and partly somewhere else. A place where ancient things are still present enough to be almost visible. The fog is the border between those states. Defog clears the mechanical obstacle. The symbolic fog persists throughout the game's story, because the ancient mystery of Sinnoh does not fully resolve. The Distortion World, the realm that Giratina inhabits in Pokémon Platinum, is the franchise's most literal attempt to depict a space where physical laws do not apply as they normally do. The landscape is composed of floating platforms, waterfalls that run sideways or upward, surfaces that are both floor and ceiling depending on where you are standing. Gravity seems to operate locally rather than universally, pointing toward the nearest surface regardless of where that surface is relative to the player's initial orientation. Moving through the Distortion World requires rethinking which direction is down. The game deploys this place at a pivotal narrative moment. Cyrus, the leader of Team Galactic, has just used the red chain to control Dialga and Palkia, and nearly succeeded in his plan to destroy the universe and rebuild it without spirit, without emotion, without the qualities he considers weaknesses. His plan is interrupted by Giratina, who pulls him and the player into the Distortion World, where the contest between them can be resolved away from the material universe that Cyrus was trying to unmake. The choice to have Giratina interrupt the climax is significant. Giratina is described throughout Platinum as the emissary of the reverse world, the banished being, the creature that watches from the other side of existence. It intervenes here not because it was summoned or because it was asked, but because it chose to. Because what Cyrus was attempting to do threatened the balance of something that Giratina is responsible for. The banished god, the creature that was sent away for violence, acts here as a protector. That is not a simple moral, and the game does not try to make it one. Giratina is not redeemed by this action. It is simply doing what it has always done, which is maintaining the integrity of the space it governs, and the material universe is connected to the Distortion World in ways that make threats to one a threat to the other. But the fact of the action, the fact that the being who was cast out is the one who saves the material universe from destruction, has an elegance that stays with you. There are other haunted spaces in the franchise worth visiting in the quiet of a long evening. The old chateau in Pokémon Diamond and Pearl sits in the heart of Eterna Forest, accessible through the forest paths and easily missed if you do not look carefully for the entrance. It is a large and clearly old house with only a few rooms accessible, most of its doors sealed or impassable. The walls have eyes, literally. Paintings throughout the building have eyes that follow the player character as they move through the rooms. A little girl's ghost appears at one end of a hallway and disappears when approached. A butler's ghost appears in specific rooms and disappears the same way. In Heart Gold and Soul Silver, returning to the old chateau reveals that Rotom, the mischievous electric and ghost-type Pokémon, inhabits an old television set on the ground floor. The old chateau's backstory is never explicitly stated in the games. The NPCs outside the forest mention it only vaguely, as a place not visited much. The ghosts themselves do not speak or interact. They simply appear, briefly, and vanish. The building's history, the family who live there and what happened to them, the reasons for the eyes in the paintings and the lingering presences in the halls, remains entirely unwritten. It is one of the cleanest examples of suggestion over explanation in the franchise. The building communicates something through its atmosphere and its design, without ever stating it, and the something it communicates is both more and less than any specific narrative could provide. The relationship between the Pokémon world and death is one that the franchise has never fully resolved, which is the right choice. The Pokémon world is primarily a world of adventure and friendship, and death in it is mostly handled at a remove through the ghost Pokémon mythology and the occasional Pokédex entry and the background lore of places like Lavender Town. But it is there. It is consistently, quietly there. And its presence, felt rather than stated, is what gives the occasional direct confrontation with it the weight it carries. The Mother Marowak in Pokémon Tower, the Phantump in their forests, the Yamask looking at the mask that was once its face, the Drifloon on a windy Tuesday, waiting for a child with a light enough grip to pull away. All of these things are true within the mythology of the franchise, and none of them are the story you are supposed to be having as you make your way toward the next gym badge. They are the world that exists beyond the edges of that story, patient and present and never quite out of sight. Section 15. The bonds between friendship, memory, and what Pokémon actually are. The central question that Pokémon Black and White's Team Plasma raises is, at its core, the same question the franchise has been implicitly exploring since the beginning. What is the relationship between Pokémon and the humans who catch and train them? Is it partnership? Exploitation? Something that does not have a clean name? The games do not answer this question directly, but the way they structure gameplay implies an answer. Pokémon in the franchise can be bonded to their trainers in ways that have mechanical effects. High friendship makes certain moves more powerful and certain evolutions possible. Low friendship means a Pokémon may not perform at its best, may show reluctance in battle, may even, in certain games, turn and walk away rather than fight when things are difficult. The friendship mechanic, introduced formally in Pokémon Gold and Silver, though present in a protoform in Yellow through the Pikachu following system, is the game's way of saying that the relationship between trainer and Pokémon matters, that it is not simply a matter of having a powerful enough collection. The specific Pokémon that require high friendship to evolve form a philosophically suggestive list. Espeon and Umbreon, the Eevee evolutions of Time and Bond, require the Eevee to be genuinely attached to its trainer before the evolution can occur. Togepi becomes Togetic through happiness. Blissey, the ultimate healer and support Pokémon, evolves from the friendship-dependent Chansey. There is a through line in which the Pokémon who are most oriented toward connection and care are also the Pokémon who require genuine connection as a condition of their fullest expression. Pokémon Amy, introduced in X and Y, and its successors in later generations allowed players to interact with their Pokémon directly, feeding them, petting them, playing games with them. The animations that resulted from these interactions were designed with a care that exceeded what was strictly necessary for gameplay. Pokémon reacted to being touched in different places differently. Some showed pleasure, some showed startled surprise, some showed a characteristic shyness that had to be overcome gradually. The system was explicit about the fact that different Pokémon had different personalities, different thresholds of comfort with proximity, different ways of expressing affection. This was a significant design step, making visible the individuality that the games had always implied but rarely shown so directly. A Meowth in Pokémon Amy behaves differently from a Meganium, not just mechanically but qualitatively. The Meowth is a little vain, a little theatrical, checking its reflection in the screen when given the opportunity. The Meganium is gentle and a little shy, accepting affection with a quality of careful trust. These characterizations are not deep by the standards of actual character development, but they are specific enough to be legible. The Move Reminder NPC, a character present in various forms across multiple generations who can teach Pokémon moves they forgot when they evolved, carries a small piece of lore that is easy to miss. The explanation given for why a Pokémon forgets a move when it evolves is that the knowledge of how to use the move does not disappear, but becomes inaccessible to the Pokémon in its new form. The way a skill learned in childhood sometimes needs to be deliberately relearned by an adult who has acquired other skills in the interim. The Move Reminder does not teach the Pokémon something new. The reminder helps the Pokémon access something it already knows, but has temporarily lost the ability to perform. This detail implies something about how evolution is understood within the world's own logic. It is not a transformation into something entirely new. The Pokémon that evolves is the same individual it was before, carrying all its experiences and all its previous capabilities, even the ones that are not currently available. Evolution is change without erasure. The caterpillar's knowledge of being a caterpillar persists inside the butterfly, available to be accessed with the right help. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series handles these themes more directly than the main series games, and more emotionally. In the Mystery Dungeon games, the player character is a human who has been transformed into a Pokémon and has lost their human memory. The central mystery of why this happened and what it means is the engine of the story, and the games use the premise to explore questions about identity across forms. What remains of you when your body changes? What makes you yourself when the external markers of that self are gone? The original Explorers games, specifically Explorers of Time, Darkness, and Sky, are remembered by the people who played them in childhood as among the most emotionally affecting experiences the franchise has produced, which is a significant thing to say about a series of spin-off games for the Nintendo DS aimed at children. The ending of Explorers of Sky in particular involves a sacrifice by the player character that is handled with genuine pathos. The player character must cease to exist in the world that their partnership with their partner Pokémon has helped save, because the chain of causes that produce that player character cannot coexist with the world they helped create. The partner Pokémon, having lost their companion, hears the player character's voice in the breeze, in the sound of the grass, in the light of a particular morning, and gradually understands that separation is not the same as loss. It is a meditation on grief and presence and the persistence of connection across change that would be remarkable in adult fiction and is almost startling in a children's game. The Mystery Dungeon series returns to these themes repeatedly, never quite settling into easy resolutions, always allowing the character's feelings the space to be complicated. The relationship between trainer and Pokémon is also explored through what the games choose not to show. In the Pokémon anime, defeated Pokémon faint. In the games, Pokémon that run out of health points faint and can be revived at a Pokémon Center. The word faint is doing deliberate work. It is not knocked out, not defeated, not hurt in ways that require medical attention beyond what a Pokémon Center can provide in seconds. The fiction of the franchise consistently maintains this gentle buffer between the competitive combat at its center and the implications that combat would have if subjected to real-world logic. The Nuzlocke Challenge, a self-imposed rule set popular among players, removes this buffer deliberately. In a Nuzlocke, a Pokémon that faints is considered dead and must be released or placed in a box, never to be used again. The Nuzlocke strips away the reviving mechanics and forces the player to experience what Pokémon battles would mean if loss were permanent, and the emotional response that many players report is disproportionate to the removal of a few mechanical permissiveness. Players name their Pokémon. Players develop genuine attachment to specific individuals, and when those individuals faint in a Nuzlocke, the loss is experienced as loss rather than as a temporary setback to be reversed at the nearest Pokémon Center. This says something important about what the franchise has built. The capacity for genuine attachment to these digital beings is real and is generated by the systems the games put in place, even when those systems are designed to prevent that attachment from ever being tested by permanent loss. Remove the safety net, and the attachment was always there underneath. The Nuzlocke players were attached to their Pokémon all along. The game just did not usually allow the attachment to be tested. The question of what Pokémon actually are, biologically and metaphysically within the world's logic, is one that the franchise has approached from many angles without fully resolving. They are clearly individual beings with personalities and preferences and memories. They can form lasting relationships with humans and with each other. Some of them have sufficient intelligence to speak human language. Meowth, Mewtwo in the anime, various telepathic legendaries. The Pokédex suggests a full range of cognitive complexity across species, from the very simple to the extraordinarily sophisticated. But the Pokémon world also treats them as property in ways that sit uncomfortably with the personality and individuality the games otherwise grant them. Pokémon can be bought and sold. They can be stored indefinitely in digital boxes. They can be released into the wild if a trainer changes their mind. The franchise negotiates this tension inconsistently, sometimes leaning into the friendship and partnership framing, and sometimes retreating into the collection and competitive frameworks that the commercial structure of the games requires. Team Plasma's argument that this tension is irresolvable and the only ethical response is liberation is a philosophical position and not a stupid one. The franchise's response to it is to suggest that the problem is framing rather than fact, that the question of whether Pokémon should be caught and trained misses the actual content of the relationship, which is specific and individual and cannot be evaluated in general terms. Whether it is right to keep a Pokémon is not a question that can be answered about Pokémon in general. It can only be answered about this particular Pokémon and this particular person, and the actual quality of what exists between them. This is not a complete resolution, but it is a more honest position than either insisting the relationship is always fine or insisting it is always wrong, and the franchise has earned the right to that honest incompleteness by 30 years of building a world in which the relationships feel real enough that the question matters at all. Section 16. The Legends Still Coming. Recent Lore and the Expanding Universe. The Pokémon world has not finished growing. Each new generation of games adds to the mythology, fills in corners that earlier games left suggestive but incomplete, and occasionally opens new corners that will take years to understand. Pokémon Legends. Arceus, released in January 2022, was the franchise's most significant narrative departure since the introduction of the Pokémon world itself. Set in the ancient Hisui region, a precursor to the Sinnoh region of modern times, the game placed the player in a period before Pokémon training was a normalized activity, before Pokédexes existed, before the relationship between humans and Pokémon had settled into the familiar patterns of later generations. The residents of Jubilife Village, the game's central settlement, are deeply ambivalent about Pokémon. Some fear them, some tolerate them. Very few have the kind of easy, comfortable relationship with them that modern trainers take for granted. This historical distance allowed the game to revisit the fundamental questions of the franchise from a perspective that had not been previously available. Why do people catch Pokémon? What is the purpose of the Pokédex? What does it mean to approach a wild Pokémon with the intention of understanding it, rather than immediately capturing it? The game's main character, a person who falls from the modern world into ancient Hisui, carries knowledge that the people around them do not have, a certain casualness about Pokémon, a willingness to approach them directly, a comfort with the idea of partnership that the Hisui residents find both strange and admirable. The noble Pokémon mechanic of Legends, Arceus introduced a category of Pokémon that had existed in the mythology but not in the gameplay. Pokémon who had been entrusted with divine power by the Lord Pokémon Arceus, and who served as guardians of specific territories. These noble Pokémon, when disturbed, went into frenzied states that made them dangerous to everything around them, and the player's task was not to battle them in the conventional sense but to calm them down, to restore them to themselves. It was a notable shift in the franchise's relationship with its most powerful Pokémon. The appropriate response to the frenzied noble Pokémon was not dominance but care. The game's handling of Arceus itself was the most direct engagement the franchise had ever had with its own creation mythology. In the game's climactic sequence, Arceus, the god of the Pokémon universe, is not a distant presence encountered at the peak of a special event. It is a character that communicates with the player character directly, that has a relationship with them that develops across the course of the game, that ultimately entrusts the player character with a significant responsibility because it has come to trust their heart. Watching a god of the Pokémon world exercise the quality of trust, choosing to rely on a specific person rather than acting unilaterally despite having the power to do so, is a piece of characterization that adds something to the mythology. Arceus is not simply the creator who shaped everything and then stepped back. It continues to be present, to care about what happens, to make assessments of character and act on those assessments. The original one, 3,000 years into the history of the world it made, still has preferences about who it will trust. Pokémon Scarlet and Violet, released in 2022, introduced the Paldea region and the concept of paradox Pokémon. Past and future variants of existing species that exist in the Great Crater of Paldea, a massive impact crater at the region's center that connects to a different time period. The past variants are ancient forms, more primitive in design, drawing on prehistoric or even mythological visual languages. The future variants are mechanical, technological, built from materials that look artificial, carrying the implication that in some possible future, the line between organic and constructed Pokémon has become meaningless. This concept returns to one of the franchise's oldest themes in a new form. The question of what constitutes a natural Pokémon and what constitutes an artificial one, first raised by Mewtwo and carried through Porygon and the robotic Magnemite line, and now extended across time itself. If a future version of Suicune is built from metallic components, is it still Suicune? If an ancient form of Jigglypuff predates anything we recognize as Jigglypuff, is it an ancestor or a different thing entirely? The Paradox Pokémon do not resolve these questions, they expand them. The lore of the Paldea region also introduced Koraidon and Miraidon, the version mascots whose backstory involves the time machine buried in the Great Crater and the person from the past or future who brought it there. The full implications of this backstory, which involves a professor from another time, a machine that may have caused the Paradox Pokémon situation, and a creature of extraordinary power that has lost its strength and must recover it across the course of the game, are still being processed by the fan community. This is the state of Pokémon lore in the present moment. Actively expanding, constantly adding new connections and new questions, never fully settled. The creation mythology of Sinnoh does not become irrelevant when Alola's mythology is introduced. The weather trio of Hoenn does not become smaller when the creation trio of Sinnoh establishes itself. Each layer of lore adds to rather than replacing what came before, building a palimpsest of myth and history and half-told stories that rewards the attention of people willing to give it. There are questions the franchise has set up that may take multiple more generations to answer. The full history of the Unown remains open. The true nature of the relationship between Mew and Ditto has never been officially confirmed or denied. The fate of AZ's restored world, what his 3,000-year walk cost the world in terms of the life energy he extracted to power the weapon, has not been explored. The specifics of what Giratina did to earn its banishment are implied but not detailed. The origin of the Pokémon world's human civilization, the question of where the first humans came from in a world that was shaped by Arceus and populated by Pokémon, sits as one of the largest unanswered questions in the franchise's cosmology. These are not failures of the mythology, they are invitations. Each unanswered question is a door, and the doors are kept unlocked on purpose. Future games may walk through some of them. Others may remain open indefinitely, their value lying not in the answer they eventually provide but in the richness they create by not yet having provided it. The Pokémon world is 30 years old and still growing. It has creation myths and haunted spaces and an ancient god that still trusts individual people enough to ask for help. It has 3 titans that predate the land itself, and 3 beasts made from fire and lightning and rain. It has a manufactured creature wrestling with existence in a cave deep underground and small ghost Pokémon shaped like letters scattered across its oldest ruins. It has an alien Pokémon broken and hungry for the light it used to have, and a lion made of stellar fire, and a bat made of moonlight and a tiny nebula that will eventually become either one. It is, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary thing to have built. And the people who built it, and the people who have lived in it across 3 decades, have made it real in the way that only happens when enough people care deeply about the same imaginary world for long enough. Section 17. An Evening in Johto. The small details and quiet corners. There is a way of being in the Pokémon world that most people experience in childhood and that some of them spend their adult lives trying to return to. Not nostalgia exactly, though nostalgia is part of it, but the specific quality of being fully absorbed in a world that feels genuinely inhabited, genuinely alive, fully dimensioned in ways that matter. The Johto region was the one that introduced the day and night cycle to the franchise. Before Gold and Silver, the Pokémon world existed in a kind of permanent, unchanging now. The sky was always the same. Nothing happened at 3 in the afternoon that could not also happen at 3 in the morning. The world was consistent and safe in its consistency, but it was also flat in a specific way. Gold and Silver gave time. Not just the mechanical time of the clock built into the cartridge, which required an actual battery, and which many players eventually experienced the failure of as the battery died and the time stopped. But temporal atmosphere. Certain Pokémon only appeared at certain times of day. The music changed slightly between morning and night. The bug-catching contest happened only on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The night had a quality that the day did not, and the morning had a quality that the night did not. And these qualities were not just aesthetic, but genuinely meaningful to how the world felt to be inside. The developer debates about whether to include the day-night cycle in Gold and Silver have been documented in interviews over the years. There was genuine concern that the Game Boy Color's memory limitations would prevent them from storing the multiple palettes needed for each map across different times of day. There was debate about whether players would even notice or care. The decision to keep it was made because the development team understood that time was not a cosmetic addition, but a fundamental change in the nature of what the world was. Without time, the world was a collection of spaces. With time, it became a place. The specific experience of playing Pokémon Gold or Silver late at night, in the dark, the Game Boy's screen the only light in the room, navigating through the nighttime version of Ecruteak or the darkened paths north of Violet City, has been described by many people who were children during that era as one of the formative experiences of their relationship with games. Something about the alignment between the world's time and their own created a kind of intimacy with the game that the daytime version could not fully replicate. The night of the game felt continuous with the night they were in, and that continuity made the world feel real in a way that was different from everything that had come before. The bug-catching contest, available on specific days at the National Park, north of Goldenrod City, is one of the small gems of Gold and Silver design, and one of the places where Tajiri's original inspiration most clearly shows through. The contest awards points based on the rarity and strength of the bug-type Pokémon caught during the time limit. Players are given a Park Ball, a special ball designed for the contest, and sent into the park to find the best specimen they can in the time available. The scoring system rewards the specific combination of knowledge and luck that defined the best bug-collecting sessions of Tajiri's childhood. Knowing where to look is necessary but not sufficient, because the right Pokémon has to actually be there. The Pokéthlon in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, the remake of Gold and Silver released in 2009, introduced a sports competition specifically themed around the natural abilities of different Pokémon. The events tested speed, strength, endurance, jumping ability, and other physical qualities, and different Pokémon excelled at different events based on their base stats and typing. The Pokéthlon was entirely optional and awarded exclusive items and cosmetic upgrades, but it became something that players found themselves returning to repeatedly, not for the rewards but for the specific pleasure of watching their Pokémon compete in events suited to their individual characters. A Rapidash in a speed event looks right in a way that feels inevitable. A Snorlax winning the strength event by a comfortable margin while its competitors exhaust themselves is both funny and deeply satisfying. The Pokéthlon was the franchise's clearest statement that different Pokémon are not simply different arrangements of stats, but genuinely different kinds of beings, with genuinely different excellences, and that honoring those excellences is its own reward. The Safari Zone across its various iterations is another place where the franchise's original inspiration is most visible. The mechanics of the Safari Zone have always been somewhat counterintuitive. You are not allowed to battle Pokémon there, only to throw bait and rocks and attempt to catch them with limited balls and limited steps. The throwing of bait and rocks was designed to introduce unpredictability, to simulate the particular uncertainty of trying to catch a wild and wary creature that can choose at any moment to flee. It does not fully succeed at this simulation, and the games have acknowledged this through the various Safari Zone redesigns across generations. But the intent behind it, the desire to create a space that feels less like the competitive battle systems that dominate the rest of the game, and more like the natural observation that Tajiri was originally trying to recreate, is visible in every version of the Safari Zone. The fishing system of the Pokémon games is another small but genuine piece of recreational experience made into game mechanics. Different fishing rods catch different Pokémon from different bodies of water. The old rod catches only Magikarp and similar very common fish. The good rod catches a wider range. The super rod catches the rarest aquatic Pokémon, including some that cannot be found any other way. The act of fishing, which involves waiting for the right moment to press the button when the line gets a bite, has a rhythm to it that is genuinely calming, and the specific Pokémon, available through fishing in each body of water, vary enough to make fishing in different locations meaningfully different activities. The surfing mechanic, moving across the water on the back of a Pokémon, rather than in a boat or through swimming, is one of the most beloved of the franchise's movement systems. The specific visual of a player character on the back of a Lapras or a Dugong or a Wailord moving across open water toward a horizon, with the ocean music playing, is one of those experiences that players carry for decades after their last playthrough. There is a quality of openness to it, of possibility, that the enclosed environments of dungeons and cities cannot replicate. These small experiences, the fishing and the surfing and the bug catching and the racing and the Pokéathlon, are the scale at which the franchise most directly delivers on Tajiri's original vision. They are the places in the Pokémon world where the activity of being in it is its own point, where the question is not what item you will obtain or what Pokémon you will add to your party, but simply, what will you find? What is out there on that particular body of water at this particular time of day, waiting to be discovered by someone willing to look? The answer, in the Pokémon world, is always more than you expected. Section 18. The weight of the world. We are, now, in the late hours of a long evening, and the world of Pokémon has proven to be, as it always proves to be, larger and stranger and more tender than it looks from the outside. We talked about the boy who caught bugs. We talked about the god and the egg, and the 3 dragons that were born from nothing to shape time and space, and the space between them. We talked about the titans who built the land and the sea before there was land or sea, and the serpent in the upper atmosphere that descended to stop their war. We talked about the fire that burned a tower, and the rainbow bird that remade 3 Pokémon from the ashes. We talked about the town where the music is wrong and the mother who waited. We talked about the being that was made to serve and chose to exist on its own terms instead. We talked about the letters in stone that no one has fully deciphered. We talked about the ghost Pokémon who were once human, and the Pokémon whose Pokédex entries read like folk horror. We talked about the dragon that split over an argument that has never been resolved, and the remnant of that dragon waiting in the cold for someone to make it whole. We talked about the stars and the alien light, and the light that was stolen. We talked about the haunted spaces and the fog between worlds, and what Pokémon actually are to the people who love them. We talked about what the world is still becoming. All of that is in the franchise that Satoshi Tajiri built because he missed the fields that had been paved over. Because he wanted children who would never find a beetle in tall grass to have the feeling of finding a beetle in tall grass. Because he looked at a wire connecting two small devices and saw something vast. The Pokémon world is not a perfect myth. It is an accumulated one, built by hundreds of people across 3 decades, revised and expanded and sometimes contradicted, carrying the marks of the time pressures and commercial demands and creative ambitions of all those people. It has inconsistencies. It has corners that were planned but never reached, and ideas that were dropped halfway through, and questions that were asked once and never answered. But it is real in the most important way that any imaginary world can be real. People have lived there. Not literally, but in the way that matters. They have cared about it, learned it, been shaped by it, returned to it when the actual world was difficult, and found in it something that the actual world was not providing in that moment. Comfort, often. Adventure, frequently. But also sometimes the specific experience of sitting with something genuinely mysterious, of being in the presence of a lore that does not explain all of itself, of understanding that there are things in the world you inhabit, even an imaginary one, that are larger than your comprehension of them. Arceus in the egg, Giratina in the inverse world, the Marowak's ghost on the 5th floor of a tower, AZ walking through 3,000 years of consequence. Necrozma, black and fractured, hungry for the light it used to be. Kyurem in the giant chasm, mouth frozen shut, waiting. These things do not wrap up neatly. They are not supposed to. The franchise understood, from early enough in its history to make the understanding feel deliberate, that mystery is not a problem to be solved but a quality to be honored. That some of the best things about an imaginary world are the things it chooses not to explain. The insects that Tajiri caught in the fields of Machida are long gone. The fields themselves are gone. But the experience of searching through tall grass for something rare and alive has been given to hundreds of millions of people who would never otherwise have had it, encoded in pixels and music, and the brief text of Pokédex entries and the mythology of creatures that were never real and are still, somehow, genuinely present. That is an extraordinary thing to have given the world, and the world in its way has given it back. Sleep well. Keep exploring. There is always something else out there in the tall grass, waiting to be found. And if you enjoyed this time in the world together, please hit like and subscribe, because there are so many more stories left to tell. Leave a comment letting me know which piece of lore you are going to be thinking about tonight as you close your eyes. I would love to know. Until next time, end of script, total estimated runtime. Approximately 3 to 3.5 hours. Addendum. Stories never fully told. There is a particular pleasure in returning to a world you know well and finding something you had not noticed before. A detail in the background of a room. A line of NPC dialogue that contradicts something you thought was established. A Pokédex entry that, read in the context of other entries you have absorbed over the years, suddenly means something different from what it seemed to mean on first reading. The Pokémon franchise is designed for this kind of return. It is built with more interior space than its surface suggests, and the interior space rewards the patient explorer who comes back repeatedly over years. Take the relationship between Absol and Disaster. Absol is a Dark-type Pokémon introduced in Generation 3, a white creature with a sickle-shaped horn, cat-like in its body, and bearing, with a reputation throughout its range in the games as a bringer of misfortune. People have historically blamed Absol for the disasters that it appears to warn about, assuming that its presence causes what it is actually detecting. Its Pokédex entries across multiple generations make this pattern explicit. Absol senses the approach of natural disasters using a sensitivity beyond normal perception, and when it senses something coming, it ventures from its mountain home into human settlements to warn the people there. And the people see Absol and blame it for the disaster that follows, because the disaster follows, because Absol is never wrong about what is coming. This is a meditation on the relationship between the messenger and the message that has been playing out in the background of the franchise since 2002. Absol cannot win. If it warns and people listen and prepare, The disaster is less severe and people remember Absol's appearance and the bad that followed, however reduced. If it warns and people do not listen, the full disaster arrives, and Absol is blamed entirely. The creature's curse is not that it brings misfortune, but that it is understood as bringing what it is actually preventing. In Pokémon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, an Absol plays a small but significant role in the lead-up to the game's climactic events. As the situation with the primal Pokémon escalates, Absol appears as a signal of what is coming, circling the areas where the danger is greatest. The player character and their rival encounter it multiple times in the story's middle section. Nobody within the game's narrative suggests that Absol is responsible for what is happening. The game trusts its players to have absorbed the Pokédex lore and understand the encounter correctly. The appearance of Absol means something real is about to happen, and this creature knows it. The concept of Pokémon that carry the weight of their own myths within the fiction is one of the franchise's most subtle recurring elements. Absol knows it is misunderstood. Its behavior, as depicted in the games and anime, shows awareness of this. A creature that continues to warn despite knowing that the warning will be received as a curse. There is something genuinely sad in the specificity of that dedication, in the choice to keep trying to help despite the certainty of being blamed for the help. Arcanine deserves a moment as well. Arcanine is a fire-type Pokémon based on the legendary Ryukyuan Shisa and various traditions of divine dog spirits in East Asian mythology, and its Pokédex entries describe it as a creature so fast and so beautiful that ancient peoples enshrined it in paintings and worshipped it as a divine being. Its classification is simply the legendary Pokémon, a title it shares with actual legendary creatures despite not being classified as one. This discrepancy has been the subject of sustained fan discussion for 3 decades. Is Arcanine classified as legendary because it was once intended to be a legendary creature in the game's design and the category was changed late in development? Or is it classified that way within the game's fiction because the people of the Pokémon world genuinely regard it as legendary in the cultural sense? Both answers might be true simultaneously. Game Freak's design history suggests that Arcanine was at some point considered for a role similar to what Moltres eventually took, a fire-type legendary bird replaced by a fire-type legendary dog before the design of the first generation was finalized. The in-universe answer, that Arcanine has been so revered in human culture for so long that the category of legendary simply belongs to it regardless of its technical status, is equally coherent. The Lake Guardians of Sinnoh, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf are encountered in 3 separate lakes spread across the Sinnoh region. What makes their design particularly interesting is the specific quality they each embody. Uxie, the being of knowledge, is located in Lake Acuity in the far north. Mesprit, the being of emotion, is in Lake Verity near Twin Leaf Town, the player character's starting location. Azelf, the being of willpower, is in Lake Valor near Pastoria City. The geographic placement carries meaning. Knowledge is in the north, in the cold and the difficult to reach, because knowledge is not conveniently located and does not present itself easily. Emotion is near the beginning, because emotion is where everything starts. The reason you set out at all, the motivation that precedes understanding or will. Willpower is in the middle, the region you have to push through when the emotion of the beginning has faded and the knowledge of the end has not yet been acquired, the place where the question of whether you will continue is most genuinely open. In the story of Diamond and Pearl, Team Galactic captures all 3 Lake Guardians and extracts a quality from each of them to create the Red Chain, the artifact that allows them to control Dialga and Palkia. The removal of knowledge, emotion, and willpower from the Lake Guardians leaves them visibly diminished, barely conscious, robbed of the very qualities that define them. The implication is that these qualities, abstracted from the beings that embody them and forced into an instrument of control, become something other than what they were. Knowledge in the service of destruction is not wisdom. Emotion weaponized is not feeling. Will that compels rather than enables is not the same as willpower at all. The restoration as the Lake Guardians at the end of the game's main story, and the partial relief they provide by calming the conflict between the legendaries, closes this philosophical loop. The qualities must be returned to the beings that hold them, must exist as generous expressions of self, rather than extracted resources, in order to function as they are supposed to function. The connection between the Lake Trio and humanity is made explicit in the Sinnoh mythology. These three were given their missions by Arceus specifically to support the development of human consciousness. Without Uxie, there would be no human knowledge. Without Mesprit, there would be no human emotion. Without Azelf, there would be no human will. The humans of the Pokémon world are, in this cosmological frame, partly the creations of these three small psychic Pokémon resting in 3 lakes in a northern region. The scale of their importance is completely disproportionate to their apparent fragility, which is either a beautiful irony or a genuine truth about how the most important things tend to present themselves. There is a moment in Heart Gold and Soul Silver that many players have described as the most affecting single moment in the franchise. It happens in the postgame, after the player has completed the Johto storyline and made their way to the top of Mount Silver, which sits on the border between Johto and Kanto in the games, a remote and difficult peak, accessible only to trainers who have proven themselves across both regions. At the top of Mount Silver, in the silence and the cold, the player encounters the trainer known as Red. Red is the player character of the original Pokémon Red and Blue. In the world of Heart Gold and Soul Silver, he has been there, alone, for years. His Pokémon are at extraordinary levels, the highest in any trainer's roster in any game at the time of the remake's release. He does not speak when the player character approaches. He simply stands there in the snow, looking at nothing, and then raises a Pokeball and the battle begins. Nothing is explained about why Red is there, or what brought him there, or how long he has been there. The game trusts the player to feel the weight of the encounter without being told how to feel it. This is a trainer who was the best, who may still be the best, who has come to the most remote accessible point in both regions and simply stopped there, as if he has run out of things to move toward. The encounter is melancholy in a way that the franchise rarely achieves so cleanly, and it is melancholy specifically because it refuses to explain itself. Red's Pikachu, which began at level 88 in Heart Gold and Soul Silver's original release, carries the particular weight of being the Pikachu we know, or rather the Pikachu that grew from the partnership depicted in the original games. Whatever adventures Red had across those years are not depicted. Whatever the relationship between Red and his Pikachu has become over the decades is not described. But the level tells a story of its own. This is a Pikachu that has been trained for a very long time by someone who cared enough to take it to the top of the world. The trainer you battle on Mount Silver is not just Red. He is the embodiment of everything the original games promised. The trainer who caught and raised and challenged themselves to become the best. The battle on Mount Silver is the franchise looking directly at what it asked of you at the beginning and showing you what the end of that journey looks like from the outside. It looks like standing in the snow in silence, at the top of the hardest mountain, having run out of anywhere further to go. The Pokémon world contains all of this. The creation myth, and the ghost town, and the manufactured god, and the ancient dragons, and the letter-shaped Pokémon in the ruins, and the boy at the top of the mountain who has nothing left to prove. It contains all of these things simultaneously, without hierarchy, each true in its own layer of the world. That is the final thing I will leave you with, as this long evening in the world winds toward its natural end. The Pokémon universe is not a simple world. It contains multitudes of the kind that matter, genuine darkness and genuine light, ancient mystery and modern sentiment, myth and science, and the spaces between them where the most interesting things tend to live. It rewards the curious and the patient. It always has more to offer than it promises on its surface. And it was built, all of it, from a boy's memory of catching insects in a field and his refusal to let that field disappear completely. The fields are still there, in every game, in every route covered in tall grass, in every moment of stumbling into something rare and unexpected. The fields are there, and they are always full of things worth finding. Good night. End of complete script. Final note on the nature of legendary things. One last thought before we truly close. The word legendary gets used constantly in the Pokémon franchise. Legendary Pokémon, legendary encounters, legendary battles. The word refers officially to a category of rare and powerful beings that exist outside the normal trainer economy, that cannot be bred, that appear once in the world or only through special events, that carry a weight of significance the game communicates through music and cutscene, and the particular feeling of a moment that the game treats as different from all the others. But the word legendary means more than rare and powerful. It means belonging to legend, to the stories that a culture tells about the deepest things, the origin of the world, and the nature of existence, and what it means to be alive in a world that contains both darkness and light, both loss and the possibility of finding something in the tall grass that you have never seen before. The legendary Pokémon of the franchise are legendary in both senses. They are mechanically rare, and they are also genuinely mythological, connected to creation stories and weather and time and space and the borders between life and death and the kinds of grief that last 3,000 years. They are the figures around which the world's deepest meanings are organized, which is exactly what legendary creatures have always been in every mythology that ever existed. Arceus and the egg, Dialga and time, Palkia and space, Giratina and the inverse of both, Rayquaza in the ozone layer, ancient and patient, Ho-Oh searching the world for a pure heart, Lugia in the Whirl Islands, its whirlpools keeping the curious at a respectful distance, Mewtwo in the cave, working it out, Kyurem in the cold, waiting. These are legends. Real ones, as real as any legends get, made by people who cared enough to make them carefully, and believed by people who cared enough to remember them across 30 years. That is all legend has ever required. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about this world. Subscribe if you want more evenings like this one, and sleep well. The Pokémon world does not need you to believe in it the way that faith requires belief. It only needs you to care about it the way that the best stories have always needed to be cared about, with attention and with the willingness to sit inside them long enough that they start to feel like somewhere you have actually been. The experience of playing through a Pokémon game for the first time, in childhood or in adulthood or in the particular space between the two that some people occupy for longer than others, is the experience of being handed a world and invited into it. The world has a structure, it has history, it has places that feel genuinely dangerous, and places that feel genuinely safe, and places that feel genuinely strange, in the particular way that places feel strange when they are ancient and not fully understood. The experience of spending years with the franchise, across many games and many generations of Pokémon and many changes in your own life, is something different. It is the experience of returning to a world that has also been developing in parallel with you, that has grown deeper and stranger and more internally consistent at roughly the same pace that you have grown older and more able to appreciate depth and strangeness and consistency. The Pokémon games you play at age 30 are the same games you played at age 8, and also completely different games, because you bring different things to them and they have also changed. The creation myth of Sinnoh is a story you can understand at 8, as a cool story about dragons making the world. At 15, it starts to raise questions about the nature of time and space that you do not have the vocabulary for yet, but that feel important. At 25, the philosophical implications of the Lake Trio and the qualities they give to humanity have a weight that they simply did not have when you were younger. At 35, the story of Mewtwo trying to understand what it means to have been created without consent for a purpose it did not choose may land differently than it did the first time. The franchise grows with you because it was built with layers, and the layers become accessible as you develop the capacity to perceive them. This is true of all genuinely good storytelling, and it is worth noting that a children's franchise about collecting monsters in a handheld game qualifies as genuinely good storytelling on this criterion. The Pokémon world has been inside the lives of hundreds of millions of people for 3 decades. It has been there in the playgrounds of the 1990s, and the dormitory rooms of the 2000s, and the commutes of the 2010s, and the long indoor months of the early 2020s. It has been there in the moments when the real world was too heavy and something lighter but not shallow was needed. It has been there as a shared language between people who might not have found other things to share. It has been there as a place to return to when returning somewhere familiar was what was needed. That is what the best imaginary worlds do. They become places, and places can be returned to. And the returning, even to a place that never physically existed, is real. One final, genuinely final thought. The Pokémon world's treatment of small things is as good as its treatment of large things. The legendary Pokémon are extraordinary and deserve the attention we have given them tonight. But the franchise is also full of the small and the everyday, a Snorlax blocking a road and requiring a special flute to wake it, the particular music that plays when you are fishing and waiting, the way a freshly hatched egg looks in your party, the smell of rain that the descriptions of certain water roots evoke, the sound of the grass when the encounter music starts. These small things are the texture of the world, the grain of it, the thing that makes it feel inhabited rather than simply imagined. The great myths live in the tall grass too. Arceus hatched from an egg. The smallest Pokémon hold the largest mysteries. The boy who changed the world did it by paying very close attention to the things that most people walked past without stopping to look. That attention is the gift. The world that grew from it is extraordinary. And you have been inside it tonight, and that is enough. Good night, subscribe, like if this helped you get where you needed to go, and I will see you in the next one.